Hi, Aaron. This is Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm calling in from an airport, so I wanted to check my audio. Thank you.
Okay.
Aaron, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, Leanne, should we go ahead and get started?
I think so. Time's good, and I guess we have everybody here. That's
The majority. Okay, before we get started, I just want to announce to the public.
Hi, Aaron. This is Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Okay, sorry. Just wanted to remind the public regarding the additional clarifying comments. So if during the deliberations of the CASAC panel, you realize that you want to clarify something to the panel, we do have an opportunity today towards the end of the meeting for you to do that. And if you would wish to do that, I would just ask that you send me an email before our break. Now, again, as you see from our discussion yesterday, we were a little ahead of schedule, so the break may shift a little bit. So just as you're following along, just make sure to email me before the break regarding an opportunity to provide additional clarifying comments. And I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Leanne.
all right. Thank you, and welcome back, everybody. We are in the middle of charge question 4. Specifically, we're trying to wrap up section 3.3 before we check back in about the overall messages that we might want to share from the entire health effects section. So just to get us reoriented, I thought I would reread the charge question. And section 3 characterizes the recent health effects evidence that falls within the scope of the draft PM supplement. So A is please comment on the identification, evaluation, and characterization of the available scientific evidence in section 3. B, please comment on whether the summary sections in section 3 appropriately characterize the recent evidence in the context of the conclusions of the 2019 PM-ISA. And C, please comment on whether there are any topics or studies that fall within the scope of the draft PM supplement that should be added or receive additional discussion in section 3, or any topics for which discussion should be shortened or removed from section 3. And so we were talking about section 3.3, and we had gotten through all the assigned discussants, and we'd had some broader discussion, but we wanted to make sure that that was completed, and particularly that I think that more clarity on the COVID section is something that we're looking for. And I'm going to turn it over now to Christina Fuller to see if she wants to say anything to help us with the kinds of points that we want to make in that section and any further discussion needed.
Sure. So this is section 3.3.2, which is the role of PM 2.5 exposure on COVID-19 infection and death. And we had a few comments by the main discussants. However, we did not have time to open it up to the full panel. So I wanted to ask what other comments there were in terms of the length of the section about related to COVID-19, and any other details about that was not said yesterday.
Nitha, excuse me.
That's fine. I'll just, I talked about changing the ordering of the section to have it go last. I did think that the length of the section was appropriate, given how new the studies are, and that there's still mostly association studies at the county level. And then also, but I do agree with I think the statement that you made, Dr. Fuller, that clarity around the reason why these studies are important, given the striking disparities seen in communities of color, and how this also often overlaps with the same communities that are disproportionately burdened by PM 2.5.
Stephanie.
Just like to echo the comments made by my colleagues that I think there was a comment yesterday about removing the section or shortening it, and I don't necessarily think that that would be appropriate in the context of, as described by Neetha, the disparities that we've observed with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as with air PM exposure in certain populations. So I think it's appropriate to have it there, and I'd be fine with Nita's suggestion of moving it later, since there's less strong evidence around that point, but I do think it's worthwhile to include.
Thank you. John.
Well, I first of all agree with my fellow ATS members, Stephanie and Neetha, but I also want to say, as the associate editor of the ATS journal, the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine, I've been getting the air pollution COVID papers, and we to review or to process the reviews, and we have several in process that are at the individual level, number one, and then there's also a paper that I'm co-author of that's getting ready for submission to that same journal, where it's a hybrid. Some data are at the individual level, and the exposure data are at the census block level. So I guess the point is, this is really moving fast, this area of research. So I think that needs to be, it probably is in there in terms of the, I'd have to go back and look at specifics, but I think that it needs to, the section needs to acknowledge wherever it is, and I kind of agree with Nisa's section or suggestion to reorder it, that it, this is a fast moving area. So there's really nothing that it should be conclusive from this section.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Christina, do you think you have enough now to summarize the key points in this section, or is there something more that we should make sure we discuss now?
Yes, I think that I have enough with regards to each of the sections for the summary.
Okay. All right. In that case, we're going to move on, I think, to the summary of the health effects section. And I wanted to make a couple of comments about this. So the charge question was about the entire section 3. And what I decided to do from a workload point of view and expertise point of view was to divide it up into subsections, which we've now gone through. And then I've asked the leads for each of the subsections to try to help us bring together the main points. And we'll have to decide either now during this discussion, or ideally later today in public, or perhaps in our small groups, exactly how we want to write this up. One idea is to have some overarching comments that apply to the entire section 3, and then to cover each charge question A, B, and C topic for the subsections a little bit separately, and to try not to be repetitive in terms of the overarching comments versus the specific comments on the specific sections. So with that preamble, I'm going to ask that Drs. Bell, Balms, and Fuller check in about their thoughts about the overarching summary of the health effects discussion and any thoughts you have on that. So Michelle, do you want to lead us out?
Yes, but I really want to look forward to my colleagues for their comments. So I'm not exactly sure, Holly-Ann, how you want to do this. I mean, my comments for the summary of the discussion really relate to comments that we've discussed about the individual subsections, like things like causality and talking about environmental justice and so on. So I don't know if you want me to go through those or if you think that would be repetitive.
Well, what I'm thinking is now what we want to do is pull out what you all think were the main like overarching comments for section 3 that were important. So you've already mentioned 2, right?
Okay.
And just to make sure that we as a committee reach a sense of consensus about what we think are the main points. And then the separate question is really how we think we want to write this up. And we don't have to sort that out today. I think we can figure that out later. That's where I was worried about being repetitive. Less so now. I think now what we want to do is get out in public and make sure that the key points are clear to all of us.
All right, so you said yesterday that we could do slides if we wanted, so I typed up some slides for us. So I'm going to share my screen as soon as someone gives me the ability to do it. I don't have host power. If not, I can just read them out, which is also fine.
I think you're a co-host now.
I feel the power. Okay. So I typed up, can people see my screen?
Now we can, yeah.
Okay. So hopefully you're seeing one slide. So I have 2 slides where I typed in what I thought were some of the overarching themes.
Wait a minute, Michelle, why don't you swap your display, because we're seeing the whatever it's called, not the presentation view.
Okay, I'm not sure.
I think it's up on the very top.
What I'm seeing now is something I've never seen before. So
now we're not seeing you share your screen at all.
Yeah,
so.
I'm going to start over, and if not, I think we can just deal with it not being in presentation view.
That's fine.
How about now?
Yeah, that's just that's the same thing.
All right, well, is it readable or do you want me to stop?
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Okay, so I'm just going to move forward with this. And so yeah, what I'm seeing now is something I'm not used to, but I think it's fine for our purposes. So so I just tried to jot down what I thought were the overall themes of major comments and I put together some threads under similar topics. I have 2 slides of this, of what I heard from our conversations. I'm not capturing everything, but what I'm looking to hear from people today, I guess, are there any big themes that I'm missing? And did I misstate or not capture as well as I should some of the themes that we did discuss? And one was on the overall style and structure. People said over and over that this is very well written and complimented EPA for the enormous amount of work and information. But several times in various subsections, people felt that there was some confusion or disorientation regarding structure. We heard a little bit about that already today. So there could be some opportunities to redo the structure. I don't know if there was a consensus on what that new structure should be, but there was, I think a large consensus, or at least a lot of people commented that structure can be an issue. And then some figures were difficult to read and things like that. Another key theme was this issue of causality versus causal inference modeling. And we had a discussion that we need to be, or the EPA needs to be extremely careful to avoid misinterpretation. This is just, we're kind of stuck with the fact that these models have been called causal inference models, although all of the research is contributing to our understanding of causality. And so some discussion talked about perhaps focusing on the contribution of these newer studies. I'm talking about the causal inference studies, focusing on their contribution and how they deal with general propensity scores and confounding adjustment and things like that. And we talked about the possibility of maybe having some alternate wording and not using causal inference modeling, other than perhaps noting that these newer studies are often called causal inference modeling, but all the EPI studies are contributing to causality and so on. I think that's actually not easy to do, but I think it would be an improvement. And then there was a theme I saw in many of the subsections where people talked about the description of the individual studies that are referenced in this document. And people seem to want less text on what was done and more on what was learned. So rather than going through kind of as much detail on the methods and things of that nature, to maybe say, what were the overall impacts of these studies' findings? And in particular, does this strengthen or weaken the state of science, the scientific evidence for particular conclusions? And then a couple of more things about the way studies were described. To be careful not to give the false impression that bigger is always better in discussions of sample size, and to acknowledge the trade-offs of those different types of studies. And then similarly for multi-city versus single city studies, there's a lot of advantages of multi-city studies, but often the single city studies have more detailed information and can get at issues that we cannot get at in the multi-city studies. So to kind of be a little more careful about acknowledging the trade-offs there. And a couple of times people asked for more information on uncertainty, and this came up in several different ways. I just gave a couple of examples. One is the way that the uncertainty bounds are described for Canadian studies versus US studies, or basically studies that might use different methods. Another is to, how do you deal with the description of a study that has this extremely large sample size and a super tight confidence bound, and to be careful about describing the uncertainty for concentration response functions, and especially, why they differ at low levels, and being clear about that. And then related to study descriptions and findings, publication bias came up kind of in two ways. One is it could be acknowledged better. I mean, we got lectured on publication bias in the earlier section, public comment section, and I think that the document could acknowledge more that publication bias is a real thing, and also talk about how publication bias does not explain the findings that we see here. So that could be explicitly laid out. And then for the heterogeneity of effects, the text currently focuses a lot on why effect estimates could be different through different components or really sources. But I felt, and a few other people felt as well, that there could be a lot more text on differences in effects for individual level variables and contextual level variables. This is not exclusive to, but relates to the issue of environmental health disparities, which I think could have more text. And while this is an evaluation of the science on particulate matter, our bodies are exposed to multiple complex mixtures. So someone brought up what they called the dreaded M word of mixtures. So I think we could add some, the APA could add some text to acknowledge that issue exists and that it's real. And then in terms of COVID-19 and air pollution and the special topics, it was brought up that we can use more text on disparities in relation to the air pollution COVID-19 pandemic, which clearly is an enormous issue. And also to recognize that this is an active area of research. There's some uncertainties around whether air pollution exposure makes you more likely to get infected with COVID-19 or makes you more likely to have a worse outcome once you are infected, and so on. So just recognizing that area of active research. Do you see the second slide now, Leanne? Okay, good. And then the conversation on effect modification and confounding. I use the word muddled. I think it was great to try to address these issues, but I found I and some others found the discussion a little bit muddled. And we've talked. It comes up a lot in our conversations about what wording and phrasing is the best to use. And there were at least several times where people talked about, I'm not sure if this is really effect modification or if this is really confounding. And I think EPA can think about giving the results and not worrying about trying to bend things as much. Some people called for more discussion of biological plausibility and mechanism, and I grouped that with a comment to recognize that this is not the same thing as epidemiologic evidence. So showing a bunch of epidemiological evidence is not showing you biological plausibility per se. We had a discussion on exposure timeframes and talked about how there's no standard categorization in the field for what's short-term versus what long-term. And then someone brought up that they do in the document give a specific definition that they're using, but it would be useful to reiterate that categorization at various places throughout the document when needed, especially since these terms are not used with a fine line. We had discussion on exclusion by location for looking at Canadian US studies only. Throughout the document, it's not perfectly consistent to make this exclusion. And here we had, I won't say contradicting views, but different viewpoints on this. I'll try to give a few of them. One, which is my view, is that there is a lot of scientific evidence gathered from studies that are not in the US and Canada. I gave the example of South Korea has particulate matter composition similar to the Western United States. Another view that was brought up, which I also agree with, is that if you're going to stick to Canada, US for reasons such as population characteristics and maybe sources, that it could be justified. So, you know, if we're going to have a document that excludes to Canada, US, it really needs to say why this was done. And then the third viewpoint that was brought up, and these aren't mutually exclusive, the third viewpoint that was brought up was that when you're looking at environmental health disparities, that Canada and the US have some issues in terms of mixing them because of the difference in access to healthcare and healthcare systems. So that was a really good point that Jane brought up as well. Just two more points, I'm almost done. There were a lot of texts about improving the language. So there's, and these are things that I think are really important and easy to fix. So we should strongly recommend they fix them. So one is not using the language non-white, and instead use people of color, to not use proxy because some disciplines and people might consider that to be more uncertain than something like indicator. And then another one is susceptibility, sensitivity, and vulnerability. I actually spent some time looking how NIEHS and their strategic plan uses these terms. They use susceptibility, they don't use vulnerability, they use susceptibility to mean intrinsic terms. But anyway, I could not find consistent documentation, even within the same agency or organization, of how these terms are used. Someone, I think maybe it was John, I'm not sure, brought up intrinsic versus extrinsic. So I don't know what the right language to use is here, but maybe recognizing these terms are not consistently used, or you know, just being specific and clarifying in the document, this is what we mean when we're using these terms. And then there were a lot of more specific detailed comments provided by the committee members about specific sections, which of course I'm not going to go through here. I just was trying to capture very broad themes.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I appreciate you putting that together. Let's see, Mark has his hand up, so we can go on, and before we come back to John and Christina.
Oh,
Go ahead. No,
yeah,
go
do
ahead.
you want to do that?
It's
yeah,
fine either way.
I was just going to make two brief comments. One is that I heard it the discussion a little differently, talking about the level of detail in the descriptions. Michelle, that was very helpful to have that outline, makes it much easier to talk about. What I heard was that in many instances, there wasn't enough level of detail in certain things. I mean, I remember a couple of paragraphs where it was obvious the writer was trying to be very concise and it was too concise. The one I'm thinking about was in my written comments about listing a bunch of hazard ratios, and it wasn't clear what the hazard ratios were referring to in terms of a health effect. And there were a number of comments about needing to add some additional detail about either, you know, size of the population or the exposure measurement, exposure assessment, or other things. So I thought actually EPA really made a big effort, and at least in comparison with past ISAs and whatnot, to be brief in their descriptions of the studies. And in a few instances, it's too brief. What I also heard, though, in the discussion is that there needs to be a conclusion with each of these sections. And in some of the sections, people pointed out that there wasn't a conclusion. We need to know, what are we learning from these studies about it? And I think that's really what needs to be added. I wouldn't want to see the level of detail of the descriptions of the studies shortened. I'm not sure they could do that without losing some important information.
Can I follow up on that before you go to your next point? To make sure
you bet.
Is that okay? So
Yeah.
thank you for that. So I just want to I'm going to redo these in case I end up using them or something for write-up. So it is a better description of what people thought overall, that in some instances we need more detail, and we have examples like make sure that when results are presented, like hazard ratio, that they're presented with the context to understand them, more information on population, sample size, and exposure assessment. But then the second part of what I said of needing to know what is the implication of these studies in terms of whether or not they strengthen evidence or weaken the previous evidence and so on. So keeping that second part, but changing the first part.
That would be my feeling
fair
about it. I think the emphasis should be on that second part, those summaries or conclusions about the importance of the studies.
Okay, I'm going to make that change. Thank you.
And then the other comment I had was about the language of susceptibility, vulnerability. I actually liked what the EPA addressed this in the 2019 ISA. It doesn't really get reiterated here in this supplement, but they had a little section talking about that language and how they decided to just use at risk rather than trying to decide what's susceptible and vulnerable. I sort of liked that, and maybe it would be helpful for EPA just to bring that forward into this supplement document and do away with that language conundrum.
Yeah, I like that at-risk language better.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for those comments. I think we'll move on to, where are we? John Baums is next.
Well, two things. Again, for all their hard work and the general feeling among the panel members that this is a well-written document. And I especially want to thank Michelle. That was brilliant to summarize our discussion from yesterday, especially for me, since I had to miss some of it, given that I'm double booked here. So I will be brief because I agree with almost everything that Michelle laid out. I will say that yesterday morning, when we were talking about the organization of the supplement in terms of how much of the 2019 ISA should be brought into the supplement, some people thought there may have been too much, but I think the consensus isn't right. The majority view was that having the 2019 causal relationships described in, I guess it's chapter 2, and then brought up in each of the sections of chapter 3 was appropriate, but the transitions could be better. I think Mike Kleinman specifically said, and I agree with him, it could flow better if people paid attention to the transition between the 2019 causal determinations followed by the effects. I especially want to support what Michelle said about heterogeneity. I understand EPA's interest in components and sources, but I really do agree that individual and contextual level variables are just as important, if not more so, with regard to health effects of PM 2.5, short-term and long-term exposures. I also highly support the need for short-term and long-term to be clearly carried forward throughout the document. I do know that there was one statement about what short-term and long-term meant to EPA, but that I agree that in the context of the literature, it is not entirely clear. So I think that needs to be sort of spelled out a little bit more, especially since the causal determinations are focused on short-term and long-term. And then as somebody who does translational work in addition to epi, I agree with, I think, I don't know if everybody agrees with this, but I agree with those that think that the biological plausibility mechanism discussion needs to be a little bit more detail, a little bit more thorough. We don't have to go overboard, but I agree. It's not the same as epi. It's coherent with epi, and it's important for that coherence to be highlighted. And the document does it, but I think it could be done better. And I look forward very much to Christina's comments, because I missed, unfortunately, because I was very interested in factors, the structural determinants of health discussion. I just caught a little bit of that when I returned yesterday afternoon. But my general take, deferring to Christina and others, is that while I applaud EPA for sort of doing more than usual with regard to SES, race, ethnicity, green space, I think it could be done. I think it could be organized better, and be a little bit clearer most of the time. And so, with that, I'll turn it over to Christina, unless somebody. All right, David Rich has his hand up.
Go ahead, David.
Well, I was just going to say, John, that when we also were talking that this was in the accountability section, there was a study presented there and described there, but that those findings, those results in that study.
Yeah, I actually heard that. Yeah.
So I just, as long as that's noted, I think and it may be in other sections as well, just to make sure that if there's something reviewed in one section, but that it may apply to other sections, it needs to be included there as well.
I certainly would agree with that.
Thank you. Terry, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, just real quick, for the mechanisms, I think I disagree with the request to expand, because that's probably covered pretty darn well in the ISA, the 2019 ISA. So bringing a lot of that forward, since it really, to me, doesn't seem to affect the PA, that I think the mechanism as it is just fine.
Well, I was trying to summarize what I'd heard from, others, but
right.
I think I'm fine with that, but I think it should be clearly stated that this is carefully reviewed or thoroughly reviewed in the
yes.
ISA document.
Statement like that'd be great. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I guess we're ready to invite Christina for her comments.
Well, Michelle did such a good job of summarizing things. So just very quickly, with regards to making some changes to language, which she outlined, formatting in terms of tables so that they're legible and that their purpose is also identified. Summarizing, making sure that studies are summarized after presentation of the results, and making sure to clarify study details, especially exposure assessment and effect estimates, and the confidence of those effect estimates are very important, especially in section 3.3, which didn't have as much of that as other sections. In addition to that, several of the discussants discussed reorganization of data and additional information about background with regards to information about race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, and how they are very much correlated with each other, as background is very much important in that section. And also some additional separation by the hierarchy of data, meaning individual level indicators versus community level indicators, and separating those so that we can better compare those studies that have the same level of data in them within the section. So that's just some internal changes there. And And then in addition for section 3.3 of including some manuscripts, some papers around children's health, and also potentially removing the Canadian studies, which Michelle also mentioned in her summary with regards to race in particular, because of the history of structural racism in Canada being different from the United States, and also in terms of the social supports as well, like healthcare, which was mentioned. I think that's all I have in addition to what's been previously said.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that wants to chime in about the overall health effects discussion? Any points that should be brought out more? Mark?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to all of you. That's a tremendous amount of job of trying to put together what we were all discussing about. Thanks for taking that on. I guess this is a comment maybe more for Michelle in terms of what you would be putting together, but I know the whole causality thing, causal model is going to be a complicated one to try and handle, but I can't remember where we landed, but I know there was discussion about whether it would be appropriate to propose some sort of introductory paragraph that tries to kind of explain what things are trying to do, you know, and this business of these newer approaches versus the older approaches, as well as the idea that sometimes, you know, looking at papers that take different approaches and how they compare can be informative. But I thought we talked possibly about something like that, a little intro kind of laying it out, as well as possibly changing the language around referring to something specifically as a causal model.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that in terms of Michelle's summary, which was great. We also, I think, made the pretty clear point that the causal determinations are quite distinct from the causal inference methods, and that we didn't see the need for any change in the causal determinations, and that was I think that's an important point to get across, since I think also that was something that was lost in the last review, was that distinction. Terry.
Yeah, just a short one. One of Michelle's first comments on the structure, I mean, everybody said that this is a very well-written document, but if we ask that the structure be changed, that's a huge undertaking. And if we don't give them exactly what's wrong with the structure, which I didn't really hear, I mean, I heard some small things, more details here, organizing this, but if we don't tell them what's wrong with the structure, I don't know what they could do about it. So I think it was fine as is, and the structure in general.
I hear you. That's why I kind of tried to word that way. So like I thought it was confusing to have like sections that then talked about mortality and then to have a mortality section, right? But you know, I think different people had different ideas about how they would have structured it. So that's why I was saying I don't know that we have a consensus on structure, although within individual subsections, there are specific details, right, that people have recommended, but in terms of like an overall structure.
Yes.
So I agree with you. That may not be a useful comment if we just say, you know, my joke is if you have 5 faculty, you have at least 7 opinions, right? So I don't know if we actually have an idea or consensus on an overall structure that could change. I do think that it may be worth making because individual subsections, there's some specifics there.
Right, but I'm sure that the EPA staff thought about that, made the decisions for the orders that they chose, and they seem reasonable to me overall.
Thank you. Christina.
Yeah, with regards to that, I know that in for section 3.3, there are some specific changes that could help with the analysis and with the readability of the section. And although I think the overarching may be some changes to structure, I agree that we do need to be specific about what they are. And maybe that will take you know, some coordination among the discussants to figure out what it is for each subsection. But they definitely need to have some detail. I agree with that.
And this is where there's probably value in our response to charge question 4, to both have this overarching points, which is what we're discussing now, as well as some very specific subsection specific points. Because I think particularly the point about section 3.3, that there were some very specific things that really apply to that section and don't apply to the other two. So that when we write up our consensus comments, I do see a role for the subgroups that were assigned to specific subsections, writing something specific to that section that is detailed about that, but not necessarily just repetitive of the overarching comments. So I think this is starting to emerge, what this clarity would be and what these distinctions are. So thanks for bringing that up, because I think that helps us all think about that distinction that we need to navigate as we move forward. John.
Yes, I just want to chime in support of what Terry said, and just remind all of the panel that, you know, the purpose of this document is to move forward in support of the PA, which we'll be discussing, and eventually a review of the NACs. And so I don't feel like the usual, as Michelle said, 7 opinions among 5 faculty, or I don't know how many panelists we are, about the writing style. You know, I think we should only make changes or suggest changes in terms of the structure and organization where it really matters. You know, we all could write this differently, but I don't really feel we're all saying it's well written in general, and I think it achieves its purpose now, actually. And the only section where I think specific changes should be recommended is in section 3.3, that, as Christina already outlined. I totally agree with her. So I just want to remind everybody about the big picture here.
The other comment I can say, and then I'll pass it on to Steve Dutton, is that, you know, when we write up our comments, as I said, I think it was yesterday, that we should be thoughtful about using language of suggested versus recommended, so that it's clear to EPA things that we think are from our point of view, non-negotiable, and things that are more optional for EPA to implement, because you know, a lot of this represents a huge workload, and we don't want to just burden them in ways that are counterproductive, which is, I think, basically what John was saying. So Steve, go ahead.
I appreciate that. That's actually very close to what I was going to recommend here, is that it is very helpful to have that distinction between what's recommended and suggested, in particular for the supplement, where, you know, when we're thinking about, we appreciate all the comments on improving language, and, you know, those are very helpful, but we also have to kind of balance that against not using different language than what we used in the ISA, and the additional confusion that could cause, since the 2 documents will be used together as the basis for the science basis for this review. That's just a, you know, an additional point we're having to factor in, but do know that, you know, it's all the same people working on this supplement as the next ISA in line. So we'll certainly take all these recommendations into account. The other point I would just really quickly point out is that we have an appendix which has a lot of the additional study-specific information that I think we've heard described over the last couple of days. So if there's a way we can reference that a little bit more clearly, that you know, if there's places where that's not obvious, that's available, that would be helpful to point that out.
Thank you. That's helpful feedback. Appreciate your input as well. Further comments or discussion on this overarching health effects discussion? Okay, hearing none, I'll ask Michelle, as the lead of the overarching comments, do you feel like you have enough information to move forward with the draft?
I feel like I have enough to make a good start. I'm sure I'll circulate it to everyone. One thing that I might look to your and others' guidance on is what level of detail we need in these comments. So one strategy I'm proposing is that I kind of give an overarching summary. And I'll send my slides to you and Aaron as well. But then I think people can let me and each other know if they want more detail in that as well, because it's hard to capture everything. And I'm assuming that this is not to include every comment like section 3.3.1 point ABC, and things like that, but just the overarching themes. Is that where I should be, Leanne?
Yeah, so the consensus comments are, there's sort of 3 levels of feedback that we give EPA. So there's the letter to the administrator, which is even more distilled, and that's distilled from the consensus comments. Then there's the consensus comments, which is, it depends on the particular charge question, but it's, 1 to a couple of paragraphs per charge question. And then there are the individual comments, and it's fine in the consensus comments to also refer to individual comments for more detail. So you don't have to go into a huge amount of detail, and you can also rely on the individual comments to provide a lot of specific details. John.
I just want to take another opportunity to thank Michelle for providing her slides. It's a great outline. And I've been on a lot of CASAC review panels, and it's the first time I've remember anybody putting up slides that so well focused our discussion. So thank you, Michelle.
Yep.
Sure.
It made my job easier too. So I appreciate that. So with that, we are definitely ahead of schedule. I think it sounds to me like we are ready to move on to section 4 and charge question 5 on the welfare and visibility. So we'll start out with reading the charge question. So charge question 5 says, Section 4 characterizes the recent welfare effects evidence that falls within the scope of the draft PM supplement. A, please comment on the identification, evaluation, and characterization of the available scientific evidence in Section 4. B, please comment on whether the summary section in Section 4 appropriately characterizes recent evidence in the context of the conclusions of the 2019 PM-ISA. And C, please comment on whether there are any specific topics or studies that fall within the scope of the draft PM supplement that should be added or receive additional discussion in Section 4, or any topics for which discussion should be shortened or removed from Section 4. So with that, the lead assigned discussants are Drs. Chow, Boylan, Panett Gonzalez, and Turpin. And so I'll invite Judy Chow to start out with this discussion.
Thank you, Leanne. I didn't comment on yesterday on section 2 regarding the overview of main conclusion for the 2019 PM-ISA, as it is maybe more relevant to the topic we are discussing today. So overall, that I feel a better integration may be needed to connect section 2.3 on welfare effects and section 4 on evaluation of recent welfare effects evidence. Both sections emphasize visibility impairment, but not climate change or materials damage. Section 2.3.1 on visibility impairment acknowledge the changes in PM composition by the region or by season. They noted that this has been affect the apportionment of light extinction among PM 2.5 species. It also highlighted a steep decline in sulfate of 5 to 6% per year in both rural and urban areas, dated from 2002 to 2012. But that those records are somewhat outdated. It's nearly a decade old and not representative of the current status. So section 4.1 on summary of evidence for visibility effect for the ISA. It further emphasized the importance of ammonium sulfate in areas of light extension. However, neither Section 2.3 or Section 4 on welfare effect have adequately provide overall perspective on relationship between the PM components or composition and light extension and their seasonal or annual changes over the last decade. So it should be noted that I want caution that EPA to note that the ISA supplement contains incorrect statement that Section 231 state that although PM 2.5 sulfate is still responsible for more light extension than any other single species. This is further emphasized in Section 4.1. Ammonium sulfate has historically accounted for a large fraction of PM 2.5 mass than other components. Those statements are not entirely true. They're overly generalized because it applies to Eastern United States, but it does not apply to Western United States, where organic mass accounts for a large fraction of PM 2.5 mass. This is also displayed in figures 13.4, 13.5, etc. of the ISA. So overall, a more detailed analysis of recent year PM 2.5 speciation data and their association with light extinction may be helpful to clarify this. As I mentioned earlier, I did not put this above statement in my written comments since I was not sure it belongs to Section 2 or belongs to Section 4, but I'll add into my revised response to Section 4 comments. With respect to other part, that Section 4.21 on visibility preference and light extinction, it is based on a single study, Mong et al. 2019, that summarized the relationship between the public acceptability and the ambient light extinction in 4 US and 2 Canadian cities. Although the acceptability levels among the study are more consistent when plotted against apparent contrast of the distant future, which is most sensitive to haze. It appears that public perception of visibility impairment or the magnitude of the scenic view is qualitative at best and somewhat judgmental with large uncertainties. I personally participate one of the unofficial preference study. It allows each participant to score 1 to 5 in a series of computer generalized, digitized wind haze scenic photo with different extent of haziness. It's kind of fun, but the potential bias is large as many scenic photos are difficult to discern to ensure reproducibility. I'm pretty sure if you test me again, I can reproduce what I thought when I first seen it. It is hard to imagine or envision how EPA can promote or implement a standard for visibility based on participants' arbitrary choice. So therefore, I like to emphasize the scenic-based visibility standard warrants additional research using objective scenario that quantify visibility improvement like haziness index or depth of view by relating changes like extinction to those perceived variation. So with respect, I'm gonna answer all 3 questions, right? Sub-questions, right?
Yeah, please go ahead right now and we'll just cover the entire charge question.
Okay, thanks. With respect to the recent advances in visibility monitoring assessment, section 4.22 on visibility monitoring assessment briefly summarize average ambient extinction reduction in the US of 2 to 3% per year over the past 30 years. And this is based on the reconstruction of the total light extinction estimate from one paper again, from Jenny Hans et al. Although seasonal and the spatial patterns of visibility impairment are documented in the 2019 ISA, those data are all dated. So the 2019 ISA using 2005 to 2008 period compared to its 2011 to 2014 period. It doesn't really represent new information for the most recent period of 2015 to 2018. In fact, 2016 to 2019 will be even better. All the publications are up to, we have data until 2020, but most of the publication is up to 2019. So I also like to know that the early publication shows increasing by Jenny Hans et al., showing increasing organic mass to organic carbon ratio across improved network after 2011, that not only increased at highest during summer in the east, and then that not necessarily influenced by the particle bound water, because part of the underestimation of all this discussion of different improved formula is partially because the hydroscopicity. So information on spatial interpolation of average monthly reconstruct light extinction coefficient by major chemical species for each region for the most recent period can provide some perspective on overall changes, especially on carbon and sulfate since the last review of 2011 to 2014 period. And I don't know if it's even possible, but I'd like to point out that Section 4 would benefit from additional weight of evidence analysis and methods to monitor secondary PMNX. That the Lower Fraser Valley, British Columbia, Canadian study by So et al., 2015, they estimate 10 results already total light extinction using routinely monitoring PM 2.5, NO2, relative humidity, and the historical monthly average the PM speciation profile at 4 different sites. And interesting enough is this hybrid modeling approach was based on the concept originated from OEQPS in 2010 as part of the assessment of use of speciated PM 2.5 calculated light extinction data by Pitchford 2010. I felt that this approach may warrant a revisit. Case study can be conducted hopefully later on at selected sites. I'll just do some testing with the available data. We have plenty of data after 2014 to evaluate the hybrid modeling approach, because this hybrid approach might provide good time resolved light extinction estimate in regions with sparse visibility monitoring, thereby may extend the spatial coverage of the nationwide visibility monitoring network. As I mentioned earlier, that Section 4 calls for the evaluation of recent welfare effects, but only address visibility effect without a discussion on climate change or material effects. Brief statements are made on Section 232 and 233 on the climate and the materials effect, but they did not give any single references. They only cited the 2019 ISA without providing any new insights. So in my write-up, I put a lot more comments on the PA, but my write-up, I felt I put a couple of references on the recent review articles on environmental health impacts of air pollution on the physical science basis of climate change may be included to provide some insights on the non-visibility effects. That's it.
Great, thank you, Judy. So I think we're on to Jim Boylan next.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good, thank you. I guess the first thing I'll talk to is Judy's comment about climate and materials not being included. And it was covered in the 2019 ISA, but I mean, probably the reason it wasn't included is because the policy assessment didn't look at these, and therefore they probably weren't included. I think maybe EPA had mentioned something that, you know, they were focusing on, you know, they had the policy assessment, and since the policy assessment wasn't going to include climate and materials, and that's probably why they didn't put it into this document. So whether it needs to be in here or not, I don't know. I mean, if it's not really talked about in the policy assessment, then I don't know if we need to have more than what's already in the 2019 ISA in this document. So with that, I'll jump into my comments. And the first is that the use of contrast rather than light extinction appears to make the level of acceptable visible air quality across different locations more consistent. So it does seem to be a better approach. But I did have some specific comments in this section, particularly pages 4-4 and 4-5 discuss an unacceptable level of visibility impairment. However, the definition of unacceptable is never defined or discussed. It appears that if 50% or more of the observers rated the visibility as acceptable, then it was classified as acceptable. And if less than 50% of the observers rated the as acceptable, then it was classified as unacceptable. So if that's in fact what was done, then that should be clearly stated in the document. On page 4-5, there's a statement that says when the features approximately reach the visible range corresponding to a contrast of about -0.03 to -0.05, about 50% of the observers rated the image as not acceptable. However, on the next page, page 4.6, it repeats the statement. It's almost word for word, but instead of 0.03 to 0.05, it says -0.02 to -0.05. So it's basically stating the same thing twice with two different set of numbers. So that the numbers should be consistent between the two. And my look at it is that it appears that -0.03 is probably more appropriate than -0.02. So just making those consistent. Also, another statement on 4.6, it says a further an acceptability level of 90% would require contrast levels to remain above a level of about -0.01. And that statement really just is not accurate, and it doesn't really make any sense when you look at the graphic. And to me, it looks like an acceptable level of 90% would require a contrast level to remain below a level of about either 0.05 or 0.07, depending on how tight you wanted to make that window. But clearly that statement is incorrect and needs to be corrected. The next thing I wanted to discuss was page 4.4-7, where it talks about the improve equations. So it mentions the original improve equation, the revised improve equation, and the modified improve equation. And the differences between the revised improve equation and the modified improve equation should be discussed in more detail. And one reason I say that is because the document states, this is a quote, and I'll try to summarize it. This algorithm was modified with the goal of reducing bias that had been observed in applications of the original improve equation by splitting major PM components between small and large size modes in recognition that atmospheric PM generally follows a bimodal size distribution. This approach has been referred to as the revised improve equation. So it first said modified, now it says it's called the revised improve equation. And then the next sentence says, however, by the time of publication of the 2019 PM ISA, new studies had concluded that the modified improve equation had not been generally successful in decreasing the bias. So I'm not sure if now if they're talking about the revised equation because it's the next sentence, or if they're actually now talking about a completely different equation in the modified. So it appears that they're kind of using them interchangeably when in fact they're two completely different equations. So that should be corrected. Also, the original improve equation algorithm equation 13-6 and the modified original improve equate algorithm, which is equation 13-7, are presented in the 2019 PM ISA on pages 1311 and 13-12, respectively. These equations tend to underestimate the high light scattering values and overestimate low values at the improved monitors throughout the US. To resolve these biases, a revised improved equation was developed that divides PM components into small and large particles with separate mass scattering efficiencies and hydroscopic growth functions for each size. And it kind of goes on, talks more about the revised improved equation, reduces biases. However, the revised improved equation is not presented in the 2019 PM-ISA or the draft PM-ISA supplement, the equation itself, which I definitely think the equation needs to be included. And I put it in my written notes what the equation is. In fact, the equation is actually used in the policy assessment. So an equation is being used in the policy assessment that's never even actually documented in either of the ISAs. So this revised improved equation should be added to the document, and basically each component of it should be discussed in the document. And in fact, this revised improved equation is basically the preferred improved equation for the last 15 years. And really the original really hasn't been used, but it's this revised improved equation that's being used by all the states in their most recent regional HAZE state implementation plans. In addition, this is the equation that is recommended by EPA in their modeling guidance for demonstrating air quality goals for ozone, PM, and regional HAZE. And then I have two more quick statements on page 4-8. There's a statement that says the large and rapid change in mass scattering efficiencies during atmospheric aging present a challenge for accurately estimating atmospheric light extinction based on constant mass scattering coefficients as in the improved equation. However, it should be noted that the revised improved equation does not have constant mass scattering coefficients, and it actually divides sulfate, nitrate, and organic carbon into small and large particles with separate mass scattering efficiencies for each size. So by including the revised improved equation, that statement really isn't true. And then the final comment is on page 4-8. It discusses mass scattering efficiencies for wildland smoke fire, but it does not discuss the composition of the wildland fire. And the document should add a breakdown of typical wildland smoke fire by PM components. And that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for that. Let's see, we're on next to Alexandra Gonzalez.
Hi, thanks. Actually, a lot of my comments are similar to those that Jim picked up on in terms of some of the discrepancies between the report and then the actual article from which the data were drawn. So for example, the contrast number and the ranges that were reported. So I actually checked back with the literature, and I think those are simple mistakes. Overall, section 4 on the recent welfare effects, I thought it was clear and concise and well written. I really appreciated the brief summary of evidence at the beginning of the chapter. That was really useful to me. I'm new to this process, and so I needed that even as a refresher after having read sections 1 and 2. I have a couple of sort of big comments. In general, I think the evidence is well summarized, but I think there are some additional details that could be added to this section. So there's a part where visual air quality is the methods are described in terms of how respondents are shown a series of photographs and then asked to evaluate, well, with different visibility conditions, and then asked to evaluate the quality of the scene and whether it's considered acceptable or not in terms of visual air quality. But later on in the text, the words acceptable and unacceptable are used pretty commonly. And for somebody unfamiliar with visibility preference studies, again, it's not clear what exactly acceptable means. So as Jim was saying, that cutoff point or a definition of that term needs to be included. So in the same way that the methods are described, it would be useful to know a little bit more about those visual air quality studies. Likewise, there's a definition of the word contrast, but I consulted the article and compared with the text, and the way that contrast is talked about, above a limit, below a limit, high or low, can be confusing. So I think that could be clarified. Also in this section, I found there was a discrepancy between the ISA and the PA. So in the ISA, the text states that the studies that are presented, which are very few, use similar protocols, which seem to me to be inconsistent with the PA assessment. So in the PA at the end of 25 and 526, and I know we'll be discussing that in December, highlights a lot of the challenges with the existing visibility preference studies. So highlighting specifically that people have used different methods and that those methods have been applied inconsistently. And so one document is saying that people are using similar protocols, and then the other is saying that the methods are used in different ways by different people. So I think that the language needs to be consistent there. I also, one really big take-home message from this section is how little research there really is on visibility preference studies. And Judy did a great job kind of indicating how important that is and how we might move forward with that. I think that given that there is only one new study in addition to a synthesis that was presented in the ISA, it made sense that that study was described in detail. However, I was a little bit surprised that maybe additional information on the study that described how photographic images or photography could be used to quantify light extinction would have been useful, given that it's one of the only additional studies that's also reported in the ISA assessment. And then I actually went back to chapter 2 because I was hearing these discussions about understanding what was in the 2019 document and how it compares to the supplement. And I realized that I was grappling with that same issue. As I was reading, it was hard for me to figure out what was old and what was new. And I looked at that's on page 240, and I realized that some of this might just be the way that information is presented. So there's actually a table on page 240 that summarizes the conclusions of the 2019 ISA. And I thought perhaps a table that had 2 columns showing what came out of the 2019 ISA and then what was new in the supplement be useful. So in this case, we would see very clearly that really there's only been one new additional visibility preference study and one new or 2 studies in the area of relationships between light extinction and PM components or what have you. So I think that that might be a simple thing to address. And then finally, at the towards the end, it asks if there's any additional topics or studies that might be added or receive additional discussion. I think it might be mentioning the growing body of literature on airborne microplastics. It's one of those things that's kind of exploding right now, and we know very little about. Well, there have been very few studies. We know a little bit about how important microplastics are in terms of abundance and their role in light scattering and absorption, et cetera. So I think this might be a place to mention that for future reviews. And with that, those are my comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think next we are on to Barbara Turpin.
I made it. Here I am. Okay, so I'm not sure that I have very much more to add. Well, I definitely agree with I have some thoughts about research, but I think that comes in the PA. I agree with the assessment of section 4 of the ISA supplement that the recent evidence confirms the well-established relationship between PM and visibility. And there's sufficient evidence to conclude this relationship is causal. I guess that's not new, that's been true for a long time. Yeah, I appreciated all the comments that I've heard so far. And I just really only had one minor comment about the gap in light extinction and light extinction predicted from particle composition. In addition to wood smoke or wildfires, the other thing that's happening is as the sulfate concentrations come down, the relative importance of organosulfate to inorganic sulfate changes quite a bit. And those two have very different optical properties and hygroscopicity. And so, that might be, maybe that's research also, but something that ought to be considered moving forward with the improved light extinction model. I think that's it, really. I have more comments on the PA.
Great, thank you. I now want to open it up to any additional comments from anyone on the panel. Okay, Alexandra.
So one thing I realized between the PA and the ISA is I don't know what level of detail needs to be in the ISA. It seems like there's a lot more details in the PA, some of which would have been useful in the ISA, but I recognize how difficult it is to figure out what goes where. I did notice, I just wanted to remark on the fact that I did notice that there was a lot of details that when I was reading the PA portion, I thought to myself, should that be in the ISA? And not quite clear. And maybe this is worth asking EPA folks where they chose to draw the boundary between the two documents.
Yeah, so unless maybe we'll ask EPA if they want to give us a comment on that before we move on to Judy's comment.
And this is Steve, and actually I can take this as an opportunity to introduce a couple folks who we do have on here from EPA who didn't get to introduce themselves yesterday. But yesterday, Chris Weaver did get to introduce himself. We also have Steve McDowell, who's on the call this morning. I don't know if they would like to. Steve McDowell worked extensively on the visibility section. We also have folks from OER who might be able to respond to the PA side. But I don't know if Chris or Steve would like to respond to that question.
Well, I'm going to turn to Steve first, and as the subject matter expert who really worked hard to pull this section together.
I'm not quite sure I understood. I thought the question was about the distinction between what goes in the PA and the ISA. Is that what we're answering?
Yeah, I think that was what I understood. Like, where should the details be about some of these things? That what I heard Alexandra say in particular is that there's more detail, more explanatory detail in the PA than in the ISA, and just clarity on whether that's what EPA wants.
Yeah, I think the main reason for that is because we didn't look at very much new material in the supplement. There weren't a lot of new papers, and the PA draws on material that was in both the 2019 ISA and in the supplement. And so there is a lot of additional material in the ISA.
Okay, thank you. And maybe I'll call on Nicole Hagan first before Judy, because this may be on the same topic.
Right. Thank you so much. My name is Nicole Hagan. I'm one of the staff for the overall PM. In the policy assessment, we are summarizing more detailed information that includes more information from the 2019 ISA, along with the information that's a part of the draft PM supplement. And that information together serves as the scientific foundation for informing the policy considerations on our side. So that may be why you see a little bit more detail and information in the policy assessment than you see in the supplement itself.
Okay, thank you. Judy.
Yeah, Jim's right, and EPA's response is true too, that welfare and climate effects has been documented in the ISA 2019. That's what the first thing I did after I see a short paragraph in section 4 that I went back to there. I put a lot more in the PA as well in terms of welfare and climate effects, because there are new informations maybe worthwhile for a visit. In addition, I mean, that it's kind of strange leaving a section 4 just says, you know, visibility effect as the whole section on the welfare effect without elaborate on that. Yes, Alexandra is right that table, what was the table number? 2.3 was very informative on section 2, but that then it get lost in the section 4 if you don't know that it's an earlier section on the welfare effect, that some new evidence on new welfare and new climate change really, I felt, need to be addressed. That rather than narrowly focus on one preference study, and the one Jim mentioned is the confusing part of the original, revised, and modified improved equation, because Tony Pereni's article in 2019 called the split algorithm approach, and did not really, only based on 16 years data on 11 sites. So it really didn't cover the whole region, not like back then when they do the revised improved equation, they did a lot of study, look at different region, different year, look at the composition changes and their relationship with visibility. So that even the new, I don't know what they call, alternative method for the equation is not real, just based on one paper, one study. So I felt the entire thing was nobody visited the data for 6-7 years, and only rely on the 2011 to 2014 assessment seemed to be a bit outdated.
Thank you. Chris Weaver.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. And just taking the opportunity maybe to circle back to the first part, Judy's question about, you know, why no materials or climate discussion in the supplement. You know, again, this kind of relates back to some of the scope discussions of yesterday, that the supplement itself only looked at new information published since the cutoff date for the 2019 ISA for certain areas, right? So that were most relevant in the development of the policy assessment. And so as with the health side, where there's only certain categories of effects we only looked at certain categories of effects in the supplement. And, you know, on the welfare side, that's visibility. Now, the 2019 ISA plus the supplement collectively constitutes the scientific record upon which the revised policy assessment is built. So, you know, again, just wanted to make sure that analogous to the health effects on the welfare side, you know, we limited the scope of what we included in the supplement, but that doesn't mean that those other welfare categories were not included in the scientific record. They're there in the 2019 ISA.
Thank you. And I think you bring up an important point that I heard yesterday that we haven't revisited, but I think as a committee, we want to think a little bit about, and that is this idea that of the decision EPA made to condition on the conclusions and the evidence that in 2019 for scoping the supplement, which does mean that things that didn't emerge in 2019 as being important enough to be revisited haven't been addressed, which is, I think, relevant to this discussion, but is also relevant to some of the health outcomes. And I'm not trying to push us in one direction or another about our advice, but I think that we probably want to comment on that, if not for any other reason than because this is a process that is not the common way of doing it. And if we have concerns about that conditioning, I do think we want to make sure we bring that out. And I'm not at the moment clear about where we should bring that up. I guess it came up more in the beginning, and maybe it'll come up also in the executive summary. But I think that's an important point that we need to make sure we bring out. So Chris, did you want to say more? Your hand's still up.
Apologies, I meant to put it down.
Okay. So I don't see any more hands up. Is there any additional discussion on this section? I want to ask Judy if she feels like she has enough information to write up a consensus comment, the main points for the consensus comments.
Yes, I think I had enough information. Thanks.
All right. So so with that, and given the time, I think we can start on section 5, the summary and conclusions. And that's charge question 6. So you want to post the charge question so we can read it. All right, so charge question 6, the summary and conclusions section, section 5, provides an overview of the evidence evaluated in the draft PM supplement. Please comment on the level of detail provided within this section and whether revisions should be made to summarize recent evidence. So let's see, our lead discussants for this section are Drs. Frampton, George Allen, and Fuller. So Mark, are you ready to open the discussion?
I am, and from my standpoint, this will be relatively brief. So this section, the summary and conclusions, I thought it was concise and an accurate summary of the findings of the supplement, and that the level of detail was appropriate. So I didn't have any major issues with the summary and conclusions. I have one detailed comment, and this has to do with the definitions of immediate versus delayed effects. And this is on page 5.2 in the first paragraph under cardiovascular effects of short-term PM 2.5 exposure. And the language is that it says, quote, in addition, these studies report evidence that continues to indicate an immediate effect of PM 2.5 on cardiovascular related outcomes, primarily within the first few days. So that's, to me, a bit of an oxymoron. Immediate to me, it brings to mind seconds to minutes to hours. And in fact, the definition in section 222 defines the lags as follows. Immediate is a lag 0 to 1 day, so 24 hours. Delayed is 2 to 5 days, and then beyond 5 days is defined as prolonged. So this is actually one of several locations in the ISA that kind of muddles a little bit this definition of immediate effect. So I think the language just needs to be consistent. The effects in the first few days would be immediate to delayed. But that's a pretty minor point. And then just one other fairly minor language issue, or maybe it's my lack of understanding, but it's, and this was also language in the mortality section that's just being repeated here, that on page 5.3 under mortality of long-term PM 2.5 exposure, it talks about, it's talking about the concentration response relationship. The assessment of the CR relationship continues to generally support a linear, no threshold relationship, which is fine. But then it says, with certainty down to 4 micrograms per meter cubed. Then it goes on to say, however, some uncertainties remain about the shape of the CR curve at relatively low PM 2.5 concentrations less than 8. So to me, those two statements are contradicting. And there's some areas in the ISA where the language is a little bit different and perhaps a little bit clearer, but it would be helpful to me to know in what way the no threshold relationship that it's talking about in that first sentence, in what way is it certain, but it still has uncertainties. So that I think that needs to be clarified. But I see those as relatively minor issues. And that was really all that I had in this section.
Thank you, Mark. Move on now to George Allen.
Thanks, Leanne. This was very concise. It's a total of 4 pages. Summary of the findings from the recent studies considered in the supplement. And there's just a single paragraph summarizing each of the 4 major PM2.5 health outcome causal categories, the short and long-term cardiovascular and mortality effects. I think detail on each is minimal, but it's sufficient for an overview like this. One thought I had was consider using the phrase causal relationship for these summaries because causality it's a critical topic of this reconsideration. So, for example, provides additional support for the causal PM2.5 mortality relationship. Not critical, but it's an idea. And toward the end, there's 2 additional short paragraphs that cover the near ambient experimental studies and COVID-19. And then there's 2 additional bullets summarizing populations and life stages, risk findings, SES and race. My thought there, and you could argue the point, but is that health risk disparities for Black populations seem to be de-emphasized relative to the topic of higher PM2.5 exposures in predominantly Black neighborhoods. My take on this is that this might be backwards. I mean, for example, look at the D et al. 2017 New England Journal of Medicine figure 2A, where the risk if you're Black is 3 times the general population given similar exposures. So maybe that whole issue I've always felt deserves more attention in general. Other than that, a minor comment: visibility effects are bulleted under the population's lifestyle life stages heading, and that probably belongs as a separate piece. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, George. And next, where are we? Christina.
Okay, so I agree with the previous comments thus far. Very insightful. So when I was reading this, I found it to be very, very succinct and accurate to what was shown in the previous portions of the ISA. Just a few edits. And some few areas where conclusions need to be added. It's more of a summary of results, but not necessarily a conclusion to what was shown, because some areas had that and then others do not. So I'll specifically point those out. Specifically in one place, this is a suggestion, versus a recommendation for those readers who may jump right to the conclusions, that it may be helpful to provide description of the overall burden for cardiovascular effects and mortality, which may help to orient the importance of the outcomes and why they are being assessed with the up-to-date evidence in this section. Just a few sentences on that. And specifically an edit that I suggest is under long-term P2.5 exposure, when there's discussion of recent studies, recent studies of cardiovascular morbidity, specifically coronary heart disease, stroke, and atherosclerosis progression, most consistently report positive associations when focusing on individuals and pre-existing diseases and among patients followed after a cardiac event or procedure and not more diverse populations. I think use of diverse populations is not specific enough. So instead to replace those words with compared to the general population or perhaps population without pre-existing conditions. Because many times you mention diverse populations, they'll be thinking about other at-risk populations, or they'll be thinking about race, ethnicity, and that's not specifically what's meant here. So just to really clarify that. So under the additional considerations regarding the health effects of PM 2.5, COVID-19 infection and death, this section doesn't have its own conclusion. And it needs to have one there that draws from the data that's summarized, and specifically the importance or what was mentioned earlier in the discussion today about how it's a very rapidly evolving analyses coming out, and perhaps a statement about that, but it doesn't have a conclusion that it needs one. Also, specifically when looking at socioeconomic status, as was mentioned in section 3, I think it would be helpful to summarize these paragraphs and distinguish between individual level and community level indicators of SES. And to present the differences and findings from each of these types of indicators and the implications on their interpretation and comparison in the summary. And also for visibility effects, that's another section that has results there, but it doesn't have a true conclusion. They discuss mostly methods and methodological improvements, but they really need to include, state what the compiled evidence reveals to be the effect of PM 2.5 on contrast and light extension there. And those are all the comments that I have.
Thank you. Now I want to open it up to the panel. If anyone else has additional comments you wish to add at this time. Barbara.
Well, I guess I noticed that this is another place where it says non-white instead of people of color, and that would be a good thing to change.
Thank you. Corey.
I think I clicked about every button except unmute there, sorry. So this is something I just want to point out. I want to say two things actually about this. One is I liked George's suggestion for these health effects categories that were previously determined as causal to reinsert the word causal at the sort of conclusion of each of these little paragraphs, bulleted paragraphs, just to reemphasize the sort of role of those original causal determinations. So I want to say that just to make sure that what I'm about to say isn't confused with my support for something like that, which is that I do want to, we talked a lot about the language around the causal inference methods. And there's one sentence here, I'll go ahead and read it. It's on page 5.2, line 29. And I think this is a good example of the type of statement around these methods that could be woven more through the ISA. And so it's in reference to the long-term PM 2.5 exposure cardiovascular effects. But what the sentence is, it says, lastly, a few recent epidemiologic studies that employed causal modeling methods reduce some uncertainties related to the potential confounding bias and further support the relationship between long-term PM 2.5 exposure and cardiovascular effects. And I think that type of specific language, that whether we call them causal modeling methods or whatever we decide to recommend calling them, it's an opportunity to say exactly which uncertainty those new methods are reducing here. And each of these bulleted paragraphs for the health effects concludes with a similar statement about the causal modeling methods, but that one, they're all slightly different. And I think that's sort of an example we might want to point to for how to strengthen the rationale of including those studies in the supplement.
So just to clarify, you're recommending that this is a good example that should be replicated elsewhere in the document?
Yes.
I want to make
This
sure
is a
that
good,
comes
exactly. A good example with respect to uncertainty around confounding, the potential for confounding. Now, there may be other threats that the methods address elsewhere, but I think this is a good example.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that came out loud and clear for everybody. Anybody else have a comment about the summary and conclusion section? All right, hearing none. Mark, do you feel like you have enough to write up the consensus comments?
Yes, I feel that I do. Thanks for everybody's comments.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes before the break, so I'm thinking we'll try to see how far we get with the executive summary. And so this is the last charge question, but that we're going to talk about, but actually the first one, and I put it last because it seemed like we should talk about the whole document before we talk about the executive summary. So this question says, the executive summary is intended to provide a concise synopsis of the key findings and conclusions of the draft PM supplement for a broad range of audiences. Please comment on the clarity with which the executive summary communicates the key information from the draft PM supplement. And B, please provide recommendations on whether additional information should be added to the executive summary or information that should be left for discussion in subsequent sections of the draft PM supplement. Thank you. So the lead discussants are George Allen, Jim Boylan, and Mark Frampton. So I invite George to lead us out with the discussion.
Thank you, Leanne. Maybe we'll keep this brief and be done by the break. In short, looking back on the last day and a half or so of discussions, I don't think there's been any major changes to key findings and conclusions brought up during these discussions. So I think that pretty much my original thoughts are largely unchanged. Section it's very brief, 2 pages, which is okay. It does clearly and concisely explain the purpose and the limited scope of the supplement, and that's a very important piece to summarize. And it notes the inclusion of recent studies on causal modeling methods or accountability, near ambient experimental studies, disparities in PM2F exposure or health risk by race or SES, and COVID PM2.5 health outcomes. Passing mention is made of visibility topics, which, as far as I'm concerned, is okay, given that the focus of this reconsideration really is on the primary health standards. Sorry, Judy. Importantly, this summary explicitly states that the supplement does not include the entire body of literature that supports the weight of evidence conclusions on PM2.5 morbidity and mortality. It notes the focus of the supplement on recent studies that support and extend the causality determinations that were the subject of extensive discussions during the 2019 PM NACS review. The level of detailed information included in the summary, although it's brief, I think it's appropriate for its intended purpose. So that's my kickoff for this section. Thanks.
Thank you, George. Next, we have Jim Boylan.
Yeah, hi. So I will be fairly brief because I agree with what George said. I thought it was clear and concise. I couldn't think of anything that should be added or deleted. So I was good with it, and we'll just kind of leave it at that.
All right, thank you. Mark.
Yes, ditto. I agree with George's comments. I had only one editorial suggestion, and that was in page ES1 on line 21 on that page. I just thought it was a couple of sentences that were confusing and unclear. I'll just read it since we have time. This supplement to the 2019 PMISA is not intended to represent the full multidisciplinary evaluation of evidence that results in the formation of weight of evidence conclusions, but instead is an assessment that puts the results of recent studies in the context of the scientific conclusions presented in the 2019 ISA. So yeah, it's not, they wanted to say it's not intended to be a full and complete review, but it is a multidisciplinary evaluation of the evidence. So, you know, and whether it's a full multidisciplinary, so I guess I think both parts of that sentence are true. I think it is a multidisciplinary evaluation, and it's an attempt to put them in the context of the ISA. Maybe what maybe EPA is intending to say here is it's not a complete review of all of the literature, but I think it is an evaluation of the evidence that is new since the 2019 ISA. So I think maybe just some wording work with that sentence would help to clarify that. And that's pretty minor and again in the suggestion realm here. Otherwise, I thought the executive summary was a good level of detail and clearly communicated the key findings.
Thank you, Mark. I want to open it up to anybody who has comments on this section. John.
Well, I want to compliment the EPA staff for having a 2-page executive summary. I mean, the point of an executive summary is for folks that don't have time to read the whole document to get the gist, especially, you know, policymakers, legislative staff, et cetera. And I think it does do a good job. I have one nitpicking editorial suggestion, and I would have said it yesterday if I had been around for the COVID-19 discussion. I just caught the tail end of it. On lines 18 and 19, coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19 infection. The infections is with SARS-CoV-2 virus, and COVID-19 is for symptomatic infection. That's the you know official or formal use of the term, and I think we should follow that.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, so I also want to commend the folks who put this all together. That's great. It's hard to distill that all down. Well, one quick point. Again, the issue of non-white shows up here towards the end of this section, maybe people of color. And then not to beat a dead horse again, but the sort of description where in it's that very first page around lines 12 to 15, where it sort of outlines the different types of papers looked at. It was a little odd to me when they say Canadian and US studies looking at these health effects, and then as a separate bullet, the causal modeling and accountability analyses. I mean, those are doing the same thing. They're looking at those outcomes. And again, it raises this causal issue. I think I might suggest not a separate bullet, but maybe with particular emphasis on studies using newer or advanced, whatever terminology we want, methods to address limitations or something like that, right? But it was a little odd to me that it was a separate bullet, because it's the same, they're doing the same thing as the prior bullet. They're looking at the health outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Any additional comments? So hearing none, and we're close to the break, and I've been reflecting a little bit on how we want to use the rest of our time together. And I feel like while it's not part of the charge question, I feel like it's actually fairly important that we weigh in as CASAC on what we think about this idea of conditioning on the evidence base that was in 2019 for what they delved into for moving forward. And I think this came up in a couple of different places. You know, there's obviously clearly stated reasons why this was done, but it also potentially sets a precedent, and therefore I think it's important for CASAC to make a comment about what we think about what has been done and whether it should set a precedent or not. And so I would ask everybody to reflect on that over the break. And I would actually also suggest that since we're a little bit early, that we maybe extend the break. But before we do, I see Mark has his hand up. So I'll see what he has to say before we decide how long of a break we're going to take.
Could you just rephrase what you're talking about, that we're going to be thinking about over the break? What is the issue?
Yeah, and I haven't had time to put down something as clearly as I would like, but I think it was maybe Mark Weisskopf who brought it up first yesterday. I mean, the idea is that what got reviewed in the current ISA, in the supplement, was based on the conclusions that were reached in 2019. And so therefore, evidence that has emerged that might have changed causal conclusions from likely causal to causal, as an example, wasn't even reviewed, because anything that was considered likely causal at the time of the 2019 review didn't rise to the importance for this supplement. And
that was actually my point.
Oh, okay. It was your point. I'm sorry,
Yes.
I don't want to give you not give you appropriate credit.
So I'm going to agree with talking about that.
Yeah, wrong Mark.
Mark with a K instead of Mark with a C.
There you go.
All right. So I think we need to provide advice to EPA about that. That isn't, I'm not sure it explicitly fits into any of the charge questions. But I do think we want to come to some consensus about this with respect to it possibly being allowed to be a precedent, or that we think it shouldn't be a precedent, that it's an exception in this time because of what the decision that was made to do the re-review so quickly after the last one. So I do think we need to have that discussion. Terry.
If someone could show the exact line, when I've been looking at some things, when I searched for the term likely causal, it said likely or likely, you know, it's had both terms in there. It didn't say causal and likely to be causal are both discussed. So is this really an issue, or did we just misread?
My understanding is there were endpoints that we did not consider, like respiratory endpoints that were considered likely causal in the 2019 ISA, and were not even addressed in the supplement. So that in fact is what happened. Maybe the wording isn't as clear everywhere.
Just a minor, if I could jump in, I know I'm
please
jumping the queue. In chapter 2, there is a discussion of the likely causal.
Yeah.
Respire. I think that's what Terry is talking about.
It's that they're not carried forward to the
exactly. PA. Yeah. Just to be clear. And I agree that we should address this issue, Leanne.
All right. Thank you. George.
Yeah, this came up, the other Mark brought it up during the charge question 2, first, the lead-off topic for yesterday. And there was a lot of discussion about it, whether, you know, the scope might preclude new evidence that might change likely causal to causal. I think the conclusion I take away from that discussion was that, you know, it needs to be acknowledged in the introduction section of, you know, chapter 1 of the ISA supplement. I'm not sure we need to carry it further than that. I don't think it sets a precedent. I mean, the supplement and the reconsiderations are one-offs. Although I must admit, this is not my first reconsideration. I did the ozone back in 2010. So maybe, who knows, but I do have some comments on that for charge question 2, which I am prepared to kind of summarize the discussions on those charge questions later on.
Okay, well, I think that, George, that would be pretty helpful right after our break, would be maybe to start with that summary, particularly with respect to this point in terms of what you're already planning to say. And then we can delve more into this discussion as we need to. John.
As another veteran of the 2010 ozone reconsideration, George, this is different. And there was a supplement to the ISA. So there were new studies to consider. That reconsideration of the ozone ISA we were constrained to the evidence that was, available. I don't know what it was. The cutoff was 2008 or 2006 or something like that. So this is different in that new evidence since the ISA the 2019 was published is available for our discussion. So I think we have to be careful about precedent setting.
Good point. They are not both reconsiderations, but they're not the same.
Okay, thank you. Mark.
Yeah, I just want to put, I can't remember whether it was George or Terry who asked for where, but I think on page 1.3 under health effects, that's where it states that what's going to be considered is where the 2019 PMISA concluded a causal relationship. I think that's where, at least one of the places it makes the statement of focusing on the causal relationships from the 2019.
Then on C2, it says likely or causal are both discussed.
On which one? Where? C?
C-2.
C?
Where's C?
That an appendix?
In the appendix, you mean? Is that an appendix?
Maybe.
Yeah, C would be an appendix.
Well, there's only Appendix A, though. We're not sure what you're referring to, Terry.
Consideration. Oh, I might be in the. Oh, I'm in the policy assessment. Sorry, folks.
Okay. Well, that's important too, but that's coming up in a couple of weeks, so we will hold off on that. And that is another point, since we do have 2 more days of meetings. If this particular topic needs even fuller discussion than the rest of our meeting today has time for, I think it's important enough. We might consider, after further reflection, how to come back to it when we meet again in December. So it's about time for lunch. I don't see any more hands up. And I'm going to suggest that we take a half an hour instead of 20 minutes for lunch and come back at 30 minutes after the hour. That's actually a couple more than a half an hour. And that'll give us a little bit more time, those of us who are on the West Coast, that it's lunchtime to eat and also to reflect and put our thoughts together. So unless there's further comments, we will take a break. Oh, one more comment, Steve Dutton.
Yeah, thank you. And I did want to just kind of reflect back to the opening comments I gave yesterday that, this is the first time an ISA has done a supplement and come back to CASAC, but it's not precedent setting for doing supplements with on the criteria reviews. And we often will do provisional assessments to update the literature when we go into the rulemaking phase. So really what we're trying to do here with this supplement, and with the decision to come back to CASAC, was to make sure that that we're updating the most policy relevant, most impactful science and topics that will be useful for those policy assessment discussions that we'll have that you will have in early December. So that's something just to think about here, that it's not necessarily we aren't setting a precedent by doing a supplement. We have done that before, and focusing on those most kind of impactful science areas is what we're trying to accomplish with the supplement. So if there's specific recommendations on studies that we could include in here, or topics or scope, that's definitely would be helpful to us. But just kind of a reminder that the purpose of the supplement is a little bit different than a kind of a fresh ISA where we would include the full range of the evidence.
And I think some of us are wondering if conditioning on the evidence base in 2019 doesn't exclude some things that are also in the most impactful category. And so I think that's where the challenge with the precedent, as if you view it as a precedent, comes is in that, I don't think we disagree with you about the idea of the most impactful science, but conditioning on what we knew in 2019, does that mean that is the most impactful science? Recognizing workload and other things. So this deserves a fuller discussion, and I think our goal is to be helpful and supportive to EPA and recognize the balancing of many factors that you were dealing with, workload being a huge one, but yet to make sure that as we move forward, that this doesn't somehow affect things in a counterproductive way. I think that's our goal. So with that, I think we will take a break until 12:30 for those on the West Coast, 3:30 on the East Coast, and we'll see you then. Looks like a lot of us are back. So Aaron asked me over the break if we should push the clarifying public comments up to now, right after the break, which I didn't mention, and then as opposed to waiting to the end of the meeting, and that there's only 3 people that are signed up, and that seemed to me to be a reasonable idea. I know that affects people that need to leave early, but these, I think they're only 3 minutes each, so they might inform our discussion. So I thought it might be useful to hear from the public. So I'll turn it over to Aaron to invite the public commenters to speak.
Okay, yes, so we will have some additional public clarifying comments. The first of which will be Steve Dutton. And again, Steve, I think I'll go ahead and do that. And we have 3 minutes.
Hey, thank you. And I've actually spoken a little bit today, so I'll just kind of reiterate a couple of the comments I've already shared with you. So first of all, I'd like to really thank the CASAC for a really helpful discussion so far, and continuing on for the rest of the afternoon here. Thank the full CASAC as well as the public for all their comments on the supplement to the PMISA. As the CASAC develops their written comments, just a couple of remarks that I'd like to share, both of which relate to the fact that the supplement, this is a supplement to the existing PMISA, and it's not intended to be a full review in and of itself. So the first is, we've received a lot of very helpful suggestions on evolving terminology and also, in the areas of causal modeling and at risk. I mentioned those earlier this morning, but also a lot of good, helpful suggestions on better ways that we could organize the information in the supplement. Given that this is a supplement to the 2019 ISA, it would be helpful for the CASAC as they're deliberating and writing up the letter to distinguish between remarks that are sort of necessary for the purposes of this supplement versus which comments are helpful suggestions to consider for the ISA program as a whole. And the reason for this is that we don't want to inadvertently cause additional confusion by changing midstream between the 2019 ISA and this supplement, given that both documents will serve as the foundation for the reconsideration. And many of the organizational aspects that you see in the supplement, as well as the terminology, carry forward from the 2019 ISA. For the causal modeling discussion, it would be incredibly helpful to have suggested language and feedback, as you've discussed, on our treatment of those new analytical approaches for confounder adjustment in the context of the existing approaches used in epidemiology studies. So this was, the discussion we heard over the last couple of days has been very helpful, and we look forward to your written comments there as well. On the topic of scope, we look forward to hearing the conversation that's about to start. This kind of relates to our charge question number 2, so we welcome your input on whether the scope of the supplement is adequate for the intended purposes of the supplement. This is we prepared a targeted supplement in the past. This is not the first time we've done this. So while it is not our usual approach that we would take when we're starting from scratch on an assessment, it's important to remember that this supplement supports the reconsideration of the 2019 decision, and it's not a full review in and of itself. So it would be considered in conjunction with the completed ISA. And last comment is, it's always helpful to have specific recommendations on studies that you've mentioned in your written comments. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for Steve? All right, I'll turn it back over to Aaron.
Okay, our next speaker will be Ned Mulcahy. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. group against smog and pollution. Ned?
Good afternoon. Thank you. It's Mulcahy. Close enough. I'm here to hope you'll consider one particular aspect of the supplement in the ISA regarding averaging time under policy relevant considerations. Section 2.2.2.1 states the available evidence did not indicate that sub-daily averaging periods for PM 2.5 were more closely associated with health effects than the 24-hour average exposure metric. I'm concerned that's more of a policy statement than a summary of the available research. In the 2019 PA, section 3.2.3.1, authors summarized available research stating statistically significant effects on one or more indicators of cardiovascular function are often, though not always, reported following 2-hour exposures to average PM 2.5 concentrations at and above about 120 micrograms per cubic meter, with less consistent evidence for effects following exposures to lower concentrations. After explaining that in areas meeting the current PM 2.5 NACs, such concentrations are virtually unheard of, the PA concluded that while controlled human exposure studies support the plausibility of serious cardiovascular effects that have been linked with ambient PM 2.5 exposures, the exposure concentrations evaluated in most of these studies are well above the ambient concentrations typically measured in locations meeting the current NACs. This issue is of critical importance to me and residents of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, where we're based. We have 2-hour concentrations of PM 2.5 in excess of 120 micrograms per cubic meter. They have occurred several days over the past 3 years, and this is in spite of a recent clean data determination by the EPA for Allegheny County, meaning we are, or during the past 3 years, we're meeting the current PM 2.5 NACs. I'm speaking to ask that in your capacity as panelists, I don't know exactly how it fits into the charge, but please consider adding any studies, insights, thoughts you can addressing sub-daily exposures. Didn't think I'd have time, but we'll further quote that from the 2019 PA, it noted that most 2-hour concentrations are below 11 micrograms per cubic meter. Most never exceed 32. And even in peak wildfire season, the 99.9th percentile of 2-hour concentrations was 68 micrograms per cubic meter. I don't know if we really are the outlier, but that we have had such sort of high levels is a concern, and hope that somehow you'll be able to address it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Jeremy Sarna.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Ned for that comment. And actually, I noticed the same thing. I actually believe that I did include a comment noting the relatively superficial treatment of sub-daily exposures and health effects in a policy assessment. So I'm not sure how much is going to go towards kind of informing the reconsideration as a whole, but I think your comment is actually very well taken, and I kind of brought that out in the PA, and hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss that more fully in December. So thank you for speaking on this issue.
Thank you, Jeremy. David.
I agree as well. I think that this is certainly an issue that many research groups have been trying to get at. But in some of it's a limitation. So specifically when we're talking about some clinical outcomes, something like myocardial infarction or stroke, being able to estimate the onset time of that condition is really a big study limitation, and some groups cannot do that. They just don't have the data for it. So some of it is data limitations, because then you cannot assign find the most accurate exposure estimate, and therefore there's lots of exposure error and bias, so that those studies tend not to be done as much when you don't have a very good estimate of onset time. So those are just some things we found in some of the studies that we've done in the past. But I agree with that it's a very important consideration, and as Jeremy said, I look forward to discussing it further.
Thank you, George Allen.
Hi, I appreciate those comments. It's an emerging piece of the science. I don't think we're going to be able to, actually change any forms of the NACs when we get to discussing the PA, and that's where this will certainly come up. My interest and concerns is more in they're similar, but they're different. Overnight wood smoke exposures, where a midnight 24-hour standard often just simply doesn't characterize the exposures appropriately. So we hear you, and we will certainly be talking about it in our PA meeting. Thanks.
Thank you. And with that, I think we'll move on to the last registered speaker.
Okay, yes. So our last speaker will be John Bachman with the Environmental Protection Network.
Thanks to committee. I'm going to pick up on the same area, and I hate to say it, but I again agree with George Allen on something. That it'll be hard to use the short-term stuff, but that presentation earlier was really important. So I take it. The other day, Dan Koss and I were pointing out that more attention ought to be given to the newer controlled human studies that actually look at a little longer time periods, 4 and 5 hours. And the potential link between these and the short-term panel studies, which have been almost always overlooked in setting standards. And the two of them together, especially with the newer information, we think have some potential for affecting what you might do with a 24-hour standard and how you might support standards that consider those kinds of effects, because both of them look at it. And I really did. This could be, I think the ISA could provide more support for larger epi studies that found effects at the lower levels for 24 hours, for example. And this kind of connection could appear in either the ISA, because the studies are there, or the policy assessment. And I appreciated the discussion that you had yesterday in particular, and listened carefully on the aspects of control human and panel studies from Dr. Sarnett, Frampton, Baums, Peel, among others, as well as the fact that Dr. Peel may actually have relevant new control human work that might help look at this issue. So we hope CASAC will in fact talk about that, because there wasn't any full conclusion of the group at the time, but I'm glad to hear you're thinking about pulling this kind of stuff together. And I again encourage you to consider those panel studies where they work. So we'll hope you'll recommend some discussion of these links either in the ISA or the policy assessment, or both. On the topic of newer studies, a little bit help from our lawyers here who used to work at EPA, and that is we'll be submitting written comments that will include a limited number of studies that we think might have some relevance, particular relevance that should be added. One of them is from Dr. Ziegler, oddly enough, from 2018, just accidentally got omitted, but nonetheless. I noted few responses from the committee that responded to charge question, I think it was 4C, about do you know of anything that should have been included? I know you have a meta issue here about causality, but this is more about on studies that are likely to move and change something about, potentially could have implications for the standard itself. So it's important from a policy and legal standpoint that CASAC provides its view on whether or not you're aware of any new studies or areas of scientific research not included that would have a significant impact or change the judgments or conclusions that EPA has drawn in finally making a decision on the standards. That's it.
Thank you, John. Any clarifying questions or comments for John? Okay, seeing none, thank you for your input. I think we will move on to getting back to the point that I brought up before our break. And it seemed like the most productive way to do it, it also jives with something that I signaled we would try to do today anyway, which is summarize the key points from the charge questions. And so I'm going to ask George Allen to open up with his summary of which charge question is, I think it's charge question 2, right? That overlaps with the discussion we just had before lunch, and hopefully that will tee up anything we need to say about the fact that this ISA supplement is conditioning on the conclusions that were in the 2019 ISA. So George, you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks, Leanne. So the concern raised by certainly Mark Frampton and maybe seconded by the other Mark was that excluding any discussion of new evidence that didn't fit the supplement's narrow scope could possibly ignore scenarios where, and I think specifically nervous system effects or respiratory effects were mentioned that were previously in the 2019 ISA likely to be causal. If there were new evidence that could possibly nudge them over the edge into causal, that simply wasn't on the table. It wasn't going to be discussed, considered. And first of all, absolutely that needs to be clearly stated and acknowledged in the introduction, and that is something that I want to bubble to the top of charge question 2 comments. That's essential. It may not matter. I think the general consensus was there probably isn't anything that's being missed, but without assessing it, we don't know, and we didn't assess it. Then there, I guess, if I understood it correctly, there was a good deal of concern about this setting precedent for future ISAs, where, constraining the scope might exclude consideration of some of these additional outcomes. I'm a little confused by that concern because it was made clear, I believe, by Steve or someone else from ORD, I think yesterday, that in a from scratch ISA, which this is not, but if it were, next time around when they do an ISA from the beginning, as opposed to the supplement, that everything would be considered, as has been done historically in previous full ISAs, and that thus we don't need to be concerned about any precedent setting given how this supplement was done. So maybe I should pause there and bring in Steve Dutton to confirm or deny what I just said.
All right, Steve, do you want to comment, or do you want to wait until after Jeremy makes a comment?
I can wait.
Okay.
And it's just kind of to add on to what George has said. I mean, for me, I agree that there's like a little confusion around the points that George raised. But there's something beyond that too. It's almost like kind of, I might have asked this in the initial kickoff meeting in some iteration, but I didn't necessarily understand the rationale behind limiting the updated evidence in the supplement to those categories that were deemed to be causal, but then again in the PA using causal and likely to be causal to kind of dictate the reconsideration. So I'm not sure why there's that discordance there or what the rationale is. Was it just expedient? Just that was the time you had to kind of update on the causal associations or the causal determination. And I don't know, that to me, that disconnect there, between the ISA and the PA. And I think Terry I kept getting confused behind, those two differences in the ISA and the PA.
Let me take the words out of Steve's mouth. Remember, the PA is a complete from scratch PA and takes into consideration both the original 2019 ISA and the supplement. And that is something that is really, really important to keep in mind. It's a little complicated, but it's important.
Right. So the evidence on those associations that were deemed to be causal were updated to inform the from scratch PA, right? New PA. But within the from scratch PA, the evidence from causal and likely to be causal were then used, right? I just, am I the only one who's not appreciating what
the PA was not constrained, and Steve, you can confirm this was not constrained to the range of the supplement. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct for sure. And the PA is building off both the ISA and the supplement. And I think everything that you've stated, George, is correct. That there's certainly, and everything that you're acknowledging here is correct as well. There are limitations on sort of staffing as well, but mostly it's driven by what we think will be most informative to the firm office as they develop the new policy assessment that you'll be reviewing in a couple of weeks. And I would invite Jason Sachs if he wants to add on to this at all. But I think essentially what you stated there, George, is right on. And I think what would be most useful is if the CASAC is aware of additional studies that could or should impact the decisions made in the policy assessment, that those specific studies would be very helpful for us to be aware of. Jason, did you have anything else?
Sure, I can add on a little bit. And I understand where the confusion is coming from with respect to the policy assessment. I would note that in the rationale in section 1 of the supplement, we make this distinction that in the policy assessment for the 2020 rule, the policy assessment focuses specifically on those endpoints or health outcomes where we concluded likely to be causal and causal. But our rationale for then focusing on causal is that when you look at the discussion of potential alternative standards, they primarily focus on the health effect categories where we concluded causal. And so that was our impetus for then saying, okay, in the supplement, what's the evidence base that they consider most strongly, and then looking at potential alternative standards. And it's those categories where we concluded a causal relationship. So maybe we need to beef up that language more or make that distinction a little bit clearer. So any recommendations you have on how to do that would definitely be helpful.
That's a really helpful explanation, Jason and Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, actually, that was what I was going to say. My understanding of the PA is focused on causality, because it's the PA and policy based, and was more restrictive than the ISA. So yeah, just repeating.
Okay, I want to open it up to anybody on the committee that has any further input or concerns about this particular topic to make sure that we reflect things adequately in our consensus comments. Mike.
Yes, thank you. I guess thinking ahead to what the PA is going to recommend, I think it would be very important for us to delineate in our discussion of the supplement ISA what evidence is uncovered from the new data that will be influential in possibly moving the needle towards one of the alternative standards and away from the existing standard. And I think that really is sort of a crux of what is going to be going on in the IPA. And I guess that's why I feel that it's unfortunate, but I can understand the time restraints, that other evidence that might have added additional evidence and become causal will not be part of this discussion.
Thank you. Let's see, Mark.
Yes, on the same topic, I sort of agree with George that, I mean, what are the choices in terms of what are we going to suggest or recommend to EPA on this question? So one option that is certainly that just acknowledge that the limitation being placed on this supplement precludes considering evidence that would change a causality, upgrade a causality determination, and just leave it at that. Or we could recommend that EPA go back and do a full and complete review of the evidence for effects that were previously likely to be causal, like nervous system effects and respiratory effects, and consider on the basis of that more full review whether the causality evaluation ought to be changed, which I'm very hesitant to recommend that. And partly because, I mean, my sense of it, and I don't know how to express this in the letter or in the recommendation, but my sense of it is there isn't enough evidence for any of these health effects to move up to a causal. But I could be wrong. But I think that's the issue. What are we going to recommend and suggest? And my view at this point is we simply ask them to acknowledge in the document the limitation and the effect of that limitation.
Yeah, let me jump in here. If currently the way I have it written up, or my take on yesterday's discussion was that we're not going to ask them to redo the supplement, including likely causal. If this panel wants to go there, then we need to have some additional discussion.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Leanne. I think that Jason's suggestion about maybe added clarification on what exactly was done and the rationale behind it, especially paying specific attention to the differences between the reconsideration of the evidence that was deemed causal in the ISA, in contrast to considering basically all of the evidence, placing specific emphasis on causal and likely causal in the PA, would be really useful. I don't think any one of us is asking them to kind of redo the ISA, but I don't think so.
Thank you. Terry.
I was going to say the same thing. Nothing new to add. I agree with what Mark's suggestion was. Acknowledge the limitation and move on.
Thank you. Christina.
Yeah, so I just wanted to just add another voice because this is a question that's being asked of pretty much the whole PM panel. So just wanted to add my take, which is agreeing with what has been said before. To Jeremy's question, I think that Steve had a very good, succinct answer and clarification. So that just needs to be in the ISA to make sure it's clear. And I also agree with what Mark was saying in terms of having a paragraph of saying what this also precludes from being done, but still going back to importance of doing the supplement with those restrictions. So just to add my agreement with what's been said before.
Thank you. Anyone else that cares to chime in on this? Looks like John Baums is not here. I know he thought it was pretty important that we revisit. Where are you on my next page? And I'm not seeing you. I know he's got a conflict today. So hopefully he'll be satisfied with this as well. Deborah Korislecta.
Sorry for the delay. As somebody who works on the nervous system, I would love to see that analysis get done, but I agree with people who have already spoken up that I think it's not something that we should recommend at this point.
Well, I'm hearing pretty strong consensus and not too much more need for further discussion. Terry?
Yeah, I think we can close it. It's given the strength of evidence that's needed to say something as causal, it's unlikely that in a supplement like this, which was a year and a half of new evidence, recent studies, is going to take something from likely to be causal all the way up to causal. I mean, it takes a good deal of evidence to make it rate causal, doesn't it? So even if we requested them to do all this extra work, I don't think it would move the pointer on any of those. Thank you.
So, Leanne, I see John Baum's in my list of participants. I don't know if he's actually
No, I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
I had to jump off to be in another Zoom. Sorry.
You're a busy guy.
Yeah, that was triple scheduled for this half hour. I only missed a half an hour, Aaron. But you know, just what I heard of Terry, I may be in a disagreement with my good friend. I put it in my individual comments, but you know, my take is that the evidence, epidemiologic and experimental, both human and animal toxicologic, on respiratory outcomes, especially short-term exposures to PM2.5, is really at the causal level. I'm totally fine with what Steve Dutton says about, you know, they can't change, they have to build on what the 2019 ISA came up with in terms of the causal relationships. But I personally feel that the respiratory outcomes, respiratory effects, especially short-term, is very strong, and I think it's causal. And I pointed out in my individual comments that the argument for biological plausibility and mechanism starts with respiratory tract injury and inflammation, and for cardiovascular effects. Lung cancer is also a likely causal. So, you know, putting it all together as a pulmonologist and both a experimental and epidemiologic researcher on respiratory effects, I feel like that likely causal is an undervaluation of the literature. But so I just wanted to say that I defer to others with whether we should go into that at all with this supplement. And I'm persuaded by what Steve said, you know, that we can't mess with too much with the 2019 ISA. But I'm glad to get this off my chest. No pun intended.
Thank you, John. Okay, that seems like an important point that maybe we could integrate into our consensus comments without asking for EPA to do a lot more work. So we have about Christina.
I just had one other point. So we're not talking about the policy assessment yet, but within that, just to reiterate, we will be taking into account all of the studies that are considered to be likely causal and causal. So that will be including those respiratory studies that John was just speaking about. Is that correct?
I think the only potential concern is any new evidence that's emerged in the past 2 years will not be included in the respiratory. But if what John is saying about it being undervalued is valid for the 2019 review, then I think it would still be taken into account.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Moving on, we can spend our last hour, if people would like, just revisiting the key points. And we started with charge question 2 with George. And I think we could cover charge question 3, 5, and 6. I feel like we already had a pretty extensive consensus discussion about charge question 4. So, George, do you want to summarize the main comments that you heard for charge question 3?
Well, actually, I wasn't done with question 2 yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm jumping ahead. My apologies. Go ahead.
We covered the big one.
All right.
Care of. There are some other smaller ones. One was there was a comment along the lines of that the chapter 1 introduction ought to provide some additional background on the reasons and rationale for the reconsideration. The PA has that background, but some here have thought that that should be brought into the ISA introduction as well. I think a big one here was that folks wanted to have the justification for limiting to US and Canadian studies written down up front. EPA gave us a verbal rationale. And although that sometimes that might have been a bit weak, at least for exclusion of European studies, East Coast versus West Coast US, is it that different than US and European? And of course, the US does not equal the Canadian population when it comes to healthcare and maybe some other population characteristics. So it's a little fuzzy, but it's okay. There was a consensus again that we not ask for an ISA redo at this time, but also to note that this is not EPA's intent in future full ISAs. There's a lot of parallels between this topic and the one we talked about earlier about likely causal being excluded. So those are, some things to add to that. I should ask Dr. Bloms whether he's okay with the discussion of the Liu 652 city paper inclusion as is. I think there was some discussion of that, but I want to make sure you're okay.
Yes, and I already apologized to Jason Sachs for misstating that it wasn't referenced.
Okay, good. Let's see. Let's do again with Dr. Baum's comments that likely to be causal outcomes are excluded. The focus, of course, was on causal outcomes, short and long-term cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. The document is structured that way, which so it doesn't preclude some discussion of likely to be causal within the document in that context. Maybe send me some text on that if that's something you'd want me to further elaborate on in the details.
Well, I think given that it's not going to change, what it's not really going to change things with regard to the PA and then what's ultimately recommended. I'm not sure, that it's worth going into that.
Okay. Okay. Then there was a lot of discussion on causal modeling strategies, causal inference, led by Corey and Michelle, but a lot of others as well. And what does it mean for a study to use causal modeling strategies? But then that also showed up in chapter 3. So I'm thinking that maybe we don't need to go there for the introduction, or certainly not in depth. Michelle's summary got into that. So my question, excuse me, here is maybe we should keep that out of the introduction, or we could put it in there with a pointer to further discussion in chapter 3 comments. So I'll throw that out to the group.
So that's it for charge question 2 then, right?
No, one more.
Oh, okay.
Let's see here. I wanted to acknowledge Mike Kleiman's comment, which I think everyone, I know, Leanne, you liked it and I liked it a lot, where basically stating that there has been a progression going from the 09 ISA to the 2019 ISA to the supplement, indicating further and further strengthening of the causal relationships for a number of health endpoints. The literature is expanding and it's not showing a diminished relationship. In fact, over time, concentrations have been dropping, there are still strong and strengthening associations with health effects. So I thought I would acknowledge Dr. Kleinman's comments on that, and B, make sure we get that in there. So I think that's it.
Thank you for that. Corey, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, just because, George, you mentioned, if there's going to be some discussion of the language around causal modeling, whether it belongs in something like section 1 or something like section 3. I don't know that I have a strong feeling. What I did want to say is that I do think that there is space for some sort of, there's been mention of some introductory type section describing what, is meant by the term causal modeling, or at least what role it's playing here. And I think there's some space for that to go in section 1 because it's part of the rationale and scope of what was considered. So yeah, that would sort of be my slight personal preference, although I don't feel that strongly about where material like that would go.
Okay, I'd love if you could send me a couple sentences that might pithily summarize that for the charge question 2 introduction. That'd be great.
Sure.
Thank you. Jim Boylan.
Yes, hi. I guess one thing I didn't hear you say, George, was I know Mark Frampton had suggested making a brief summary of the previous CASAC recommendations and how they were being addressed. Was that something you were planning to put into your recommendations?
Yeah, there's a very brief thing I mentioned. The introduction ought to provide some additional background on the reasons and rationale for this reconsideration. We find that in the PA, but it's not in the ISA. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, so specifically, Mark Frampton had said, the previous CASAC recommendations from last year or 2 years ago should be incorporated in there. And he had some written comments on that. And then making a recommendation that EPA might even want to address how they addressed the CASAC comments last time. So I think that should be in there as well.
Okay.
So I saw Mark put his hand up. So John, I'm going to skip over you and ask Mark to follow up because I'm sure it's pertinent to this point.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, John. Yeah, I would be interested in kind of other panels members' interest in this. Yeah, that was my comment, was that especially considering the unique nature of this of the events surrounding this PM review and CASAC, and then the reconstitution of CASAC. I think it deserves some very specific background about what happened with the CASAC review, what the CASAC consensus recommendations were, and how EPA responded to them in the final ISA, which I did not see. I mean, I saw the final ISA, and they did not take all of CASAC's suggestions or recommendations, but I didn't see anywhere any reasons for the items they chose not to take the recommendation. So I think it would be good to have that background in there. Even, it has mostly to do with the likely not causal health effects, but the likely to be causal determinations, those recommendations. So it's not perhaps directly relevant to the PA in the setting of the standard, but given the unusual nature of this whole review process and what we've been through, I think some additional transparency is warranted.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that before we move to another point. And I particularly want to put Mark and Jim on the spot a little bit because you were both part of the last review, and it was an unusual, in my experience, process. and in particular with only 7 members of CASAC and disbanding the previous PM panel. And is there a role not only for asking EPA to weigh in and the ISA about it, but for us to weigh in with any comments now? And I'm not looking to politicize it or anything, but is there anything we should be saying about that rather than just asking EPA to put some more background in, which sounds a little bit bland to me?
Oh, this is Jim. I'll go first. And that's a good question. I think, some of the issues might be more straightforward, such as recommendations of causal versus non-causal or likely to be causal. But then there's the issue of, questioning the whole causal framework, right? I mean, that was one of CASAC's comments last time, and it was questioning the whole causal framework at all. So, maybe that is something that if the current CASAC thinks the causal framework has no issues, that they need to weigh in and say that, which would be different than the last CASAC. And this might be a whole new discussion. And it's my understanding that there has been follow-up on a work group that's been developed to actually look at the causal framework to see if there are other approaches to doing it going forward. And so, like you said, it might be worth talking about this further. Mark, do you have something to add?
Yes, I was just going to add that actually we didn't reach consent. The previous CASAC did not reach consensus on the issue of the causality framework. There certainly were members of the committee that wanted to trash it and change it completely. And at least one member of the committee did not agree with that. So there was lack of consensus, but I think that's a good point is would it be useful for our letter to provide its own background of what happened with the previous CASAC and the recommendation, what were the recommendations of the previous CASAC, what was consensus, what was not, as background to our letter to EPA. I hadn't thought about that, but maybe it's worth considering.
Yeah, I think there could be some important value added actually for us to do that. And so we'll have to think about how we can navigate that. John, I think we're ready for you to chime in.
Well, I had my hand up to support what Corey Ziegler said about having at least some sentences in the introduction about causal methods. I think it's really key because it's, throughout the document comes up. So I just want to support that. But I'm glad that I kept my hand or that you passed over me because I too think that it would be very important to have our letter in as unpoliticized way as possible discuss what happened with the previous CASAC review, because I think it was different than previous reviews over several decades. And I remember when Regine Henderson was CASAC chair and I was on I'm an old guy, George. And she wrote, or, we wrote as a group, but she took the lead in drafting comments to the administrator about how it was unacceptable to reject the advice of CASAC. At that time, it was about uncertainty, where, we felt that the certainty about PM 2.5 and some outcomes was pretty strong. And then the administrator used scientific uncertainty as an excuse for not changing the standard. And, Regine and our review panel lectured in response that we were supposed to be assessing the scientific uncertainty. And we felt the scientific literature was certain enough to move forward with a stricter standard. So I think I, for one, would like us to support the causal framework that was developed over time. And I mean, I think John Samet was one of the leaders when he was CASAC chair about establishing the causal framework. You know, it can be tweaked. I don't have any problem with improving it, but throwing it, you know, as Mark Frampton said, trashing it, you know, that was something that I wouldn't have voted for either.
And just to clarify that the Rogine "We are not happy" letter from the 2008 review was for ozone.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah.
I realized that I had said that inappropriately. I actually wasn't even on the PM 2.5 panel back then. It was on the ozone panel. Thank you, George.
Yeah, and that's why the next ozone review letter was littered with this is our scientific judgment and this is our policy judgment.
Correct.
I don't think we have that problem anymore. I hope we don't.
Yes.
But
Okay, I'm going to suggest that this, as John put it, well, unpoliticized summary of what happened last time, that we assign a writing group to do that. And I'm gonna volunteer myself, Mark, and Jim, and I'd like to invite anybody else who would like to join that group to, assuming Mark and Jim don't object, to join that group. Okay, Terry Gordon.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that there should be no politics in this at all. But I want to reemphasize what Mark said. We can address things that came about from the last CASAC and how we differ in opinion and interpretation. Beyond that, I'm not sure we should. Are you guys trying to say we should rehash what happened and write down, you know, this happened to this committee and this happened? I don't know if there's a purpose in that, but addressing how they made decisions where we differ, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Barbara.
I think what I heard John say is that we should describe the process and how it differed from the standard process. I mean, I think that there probably are some draft words around that already that, you know, one that we could draw from, but is that what you meant, John?
Yes, but I also, you know, if the causal framework was, you know, I'd have to go back and look, but if the causal framework was being thrown out, you know, I would think we can opine about that as well.
George.
And that's what I was going to emphasize, that, you know, as you go through this retrospective piece, I think the most important aspect is the previous reviews take on the causal framework. You know, just ignoring multiple previous reviews, all the work of John Samet and others in establishing that over many years, and just saying, nope. So I think if we do this, that might be the key issue to address. And that's not political. That's really more scientific. The whole issue of weight of evidence and such.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And the other thing, I think this piece is important the more I think about it, because it directly impacts the reasons for this reconsideration. And so I think we can give the history of the CASAC involvement and the CASAC recommendations. And as part of that history, I think we need to point out that CASAC did not come to consensus about causality of PM for mortality. I mean, that's in the letter. And a number of members of CASAC did not believe that PM was causal, that causality determination was in fact correct. And maybe that's one area we can point out where perhaps this CASAC panel does have consensus in that regard.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, so, I don't know if everybody on the last CASAC thought the causal framework should be completely thrown out. I think one of the point was that in many cases it was arbitrary. And an example would be where EPA came up with a causal determination, and then CASAC looked at it, came up with a different, looking at the same evidence, came up with a different causal determination, and then EPA went back and changed it. And I mean, which leads to the, that it is somewhat arbitrary. And so, I mean, I think, I don't think everybody on the last CASAC thought it should be completely thrown out. I thought the idea was it should be reevaluated and re-looked at for improvement. So, I think that can be discussed. And I guess, Leanne, maybe that's the small group you're talking about that we can kind of put this together. So I think it's a good idea to kind of lay that out.
Okay, thank you. So the three of us will work on trying to figure out how to navigate a paragraph or two that just really summarize the past review and in particular with attention to the comments that CASAC made with respect to the causal determinations, and contrast or compare or contrast where we are versus where that previous panel was, and try to do that as clearly and concisely as possible. Okay, are we ready to move on? We have another half hour, and so we can spend a little bit of time making sure that we have consensus on some other charge questions. Next up is charge question 3, and that's also George.
And it will be brief, I promise. It's much simpler. I think that there was discussion of, chapter 2, does it belong there or not? And I heard, it wasn't unanimous, but a pretty good consensus that leave it in. It's useful, especially to those who were not involved last time around. There's minimal harm to having it there. Also, the panel seemed to like the mini summaries that are at the start of each major section of chapter 3. I heard good things about that. I think I heard that maybe the transitions between the retrospective summaries and the new stuff could be a little smoother. But really that's about it.
Thank you. Anyone want to, Barbara?
Well, and George, I think by smoother, I think people meant that to be more clear that now we're talking about new evidence from the supplement.
Okay. Yep. Okay.
Thank you. We're going to skip section 3 because we had a pretty full discussion about that already. And thank you again to Michelle. As was noted, that was a really nice to the point summary. So that was very helpful. I don't think we need to revisit that. Next up is a brief summary of the main points from charge question 5, section 4. Let's see, who is that? That is Judy Chow.
Yeah, I think that in general, committee agree with the assessment in section 4 that confirms the causal relationship between PM and visibility, with a few clarification in terms of the terminology of contrast and the level of contrast instead of total light extinction appear to be more consistent, but to determine the acceptable level. But contrast level are giving the ISA supplement, giving us inconsistent level that need to be clarified. And the committee also, Jim mentioned that the definition of original, revised, and modified improved equation that has been used for years, for 15 years, as Jim mentioned, for the regional haze SIP, state implementation plan, that need to be further clarified, along with the mass coefficient, mass scattering coefficient for the major PM component. And we don't have a lot of discussion on material damage and climate effect, but I thought Alexandra pointed out that the really good point. I also mentioned that in my PA is the recent growing interest on microplastic, which do appear, there's articles in both Nature and Science recently that have maybe cause some attention or put some references, at least acknowledge the existence of the issues indirect radiative forcing of the microplastic. That's a new thing in terms of climate changes and visibility impairment. So I'll try to put this, and I see people felt, I mean, I know we're not supposed to see, my main issue is that we are based on 2014 measurement, and the 2015 beyond need to be addressed, especially with the recent changes of sulfate and nitrate. And Barbara mentioned the different ratios of sulfate and organics, and which might really have some significant effect on the estimation of light attenuation. So that I guess those are the main point. I will ask my committee member if I missed anything there.
Thank you, Judy. Anyone care to weigh in on that summary? Okay, not hearing any, we'll move on to charge question 6, the summary and conclusion. That was,
Yeah, that was me, I
Mark.
think. Yeah. So just summarizing what I heard, I was pretty happy with it. I had a minor editorial change that I raised. George felt that also the detail was minimal but adequate, was I think what I heard. And he talked about adding the causality determination as part of the summary, which I agree with. And he pointed out that the at-risk population in the Black population, for instance, it's not just increased exposure, and that needs more emphasis. And Christina suggested adding some background about the burden in this summary section, adding background about the burden of cardiovascular disease, which I agree with could be done very, very briefly. Pointed out the word diverse in one context is probably inappropriate. It'd be better to state the comparison with a defined population. And then COVID-19 section needs conclusions, and that it's a rapidly evolving area, and so include individual and community level indicators under socioeconomic status, and the visibility section needs conclusions. And Barbara pointed out that the non-white language needs to be changed. And Corey supported inserting the causality determination in that summary, and pointed out one example of some good language, I think, about the causal framework studies, not the causal framework, the causal modeling studies. And that's all I had. Any additional, anything I missed?
That's good. That's complete from my end.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll move on to the last charge question, which was charge question 1, the executive summary. So that's back to George.
Let's see here. I think, I'm not sure I actually went through and looked back at that. If I did, I can't find my notes. So I will probably have to pass.
Okay, I don't recall that there was too much we said about that from my memory. If anybody wants to chime in with any important point that you want to make sure that George doesn't miss, which he probably won't do anyway, because he'll be going back over it and looking at all that.
Yeah, I've got some notes. Like I said, I haven't yet digested them, but I do have notes. So
okay. So unless anybody has any important points they want to bring up, we have 20 minutes left, but we might be able to end a little bit early. I wanted to say a few things. We went over yesterday a little bit of the process for how we're going to follow up from this meeting. And as we said yesterday, the assigned discussants will draft consensus comments, and that will be led by the lead discussant, who's the person whose name is underlined. Anyone who wishes to contribute to something you weren't assigned to, you are welcome to, as long as we don't get more than half the committee communicating together in any one conversation. I specifically heard yesterday that Jane Clougherty would like to join section 3.3. Otherwise, I don't think I heard anything specific on that, but certainly you're welcome to contribute if we miss something that you want to weigh in on. And of course, anything you said in public should have been, hopefully will be captured by the group, and we'll all have an opportunity in what'll probably be around February to discuss our draft consensus comments. Another suggestion, which Aaron and I can try to do, but if you would like to do it, it would be helpful, is from your consensus comments, if you want to pull out some few key bullets for the letter to guide us. I mean, we will also be doing and thinking about that. Or you could even highlight a couple of sentences in your consensus comments that you think belong in the letter, anything simple to help us. So the other piece that will be done is that not only will we compile all these consensus comments in the order of the charge questions, but then we will provide a letter to the administrator with the most important points from the consensus comments. And so you are welcome to help us do that job by highlighting a few key points. And if you don't do that, we'll do that for you. So that's it on, I think that's it on writing it up. We will work more offline on a schedule and deadline, but you should plan, we're viewing this all as one big meeting. So you should really plan on having your whole group comments together by the end of the holidays, like right around the new year. We'll hammer out specific dates a little bit later. And of course, you're welcome now, if you're not too absorbed in the policy assessment preparation, you're welcome to start on this right away. I also wanted to comment, we have 2 days and only 4 hours, even less if you subtract our lunch breaks, for the policy assessment, and that could actually generate a lot more discussion. So we'll want to be mindful when we share the discussion in December. We'll want to be mindful of not focusing too much on details, because they'll still be in the our preliminary comments, EPA, and our final comments. EPA will get those, but if they don't rise to the level of recommended, and probably even some of the things that don't rise, that, you know, even some of the things that are suggested we may want to share, but if we, you know, some of them could also not be voiced. If they're not going to end up in the consensus comments, they probably don't need to be voiced in the public meeting. And we do want to make sure that we don't run out of time for the most important part of that discussion, which is the policy recommendations. And that can take, that may take longer than we think. Or at least I'm a little bit mindful that that's possible. So I see George has his hand up.
Yes, thanks, Leanne. Actually, you brought up a point that for those who are new to this process, it's important to realize that if a topic is not brought up verbally during deliberations, my understanding is that you cannot include it in the letter or the detailed discussion of response to comments. Leanna, I think that's correct, but Aaron can confirm or deny that.
I think that's the general guidance, but because we're going to have a public meeting where we're going to discuss our consensus comments, there is an opportunity for those things to be made public at that time. So while we would recommend that anything that we want to put in the consensus comments does get said orally in the December meeting, you know, there is another opportunity for it to be said in public during the follow-up meeting. So, Mark.
Yeah, just on that point, during the previous CASAC deliberations, I learned that the hard way. I failed to object to some language that during our public meeting that was in the draft letter that we were working with. And when I realized it the following day and wanted to object to it, it was too late. So if you want to object, it has to be, if you want to have something included or changed in the draft letter or in the document, yes, it needs to be brought up either in written comments or in a public meeting.
So just to clarify for that, Mark, that was after our final meeting, and that's why. So because we still will have another meeting in February, I believe, to discuss the draft report, there is still that opportunity to raise concerns in public.
Right.
And so, Leanne,
if you don't put it in on that final meeting, you're in trouble.
Yes. But so Leanne was exactly correct. And sometimes that happens. You know, we definitely prefer that everything get hashed out now. But sometimes in drafting the report, you know, the subgroup may come up with different things, and that's okay because it will be deliberated by the full panel during the subsequent meeting.
Thank you, Aaron. Mark, you had a comment.
Yeah, really just more clarification, given that I'm also new to this. I mean, in this discussion about what gets said versus not said, I mean, for example, in the last comments that I gave on the section, in my written comments, I had a few very sort of, you know, something specific to the way a paper was described, and I thought maybe they didn't capture the appropriate thing. I didn't bother talking about that because I thought that was too much detail. Is that what we're talking about? Or is if I've got it in a written comment, it's there, or do I need to voice every one of those? I'm just wanting that round.
Yeah, I think the distinction I would make is if it's a recommendation that we think EPA needs to make a change. So we're making a recommendation more than a suggestion. I think EPA is in good faith going to correct anything that we identify that is that we think is incorrect. But if if whatever we think is incorrect, you think rises to the level of recommending that EPA make a change in the current ISA, for example, then you probably do need to say it in public. I hear what I think you're asking, like how much detail do we want to dig into? And that's going to be particularly, I think, important in the policy assessment, because I don't want us to get lost in the details and not capture the big picture, which for the policy assessment, I think is going to be particularly important. So I'm not sure I'm completely answering your question.
I can ask a very concrete example. There was one section where they simply got the statement wrong. They said for a 10-unit decrease in PM, this will happen. And it was actually, it should have been an increase. And now that's a very minor thing, but it needs to be changed because they are misrepresenting the paper. But I didn't say it because it's a very quick change with a written comment. But I was just trying to find out whether I'm supposed to now be explicitly saying.
Just to clarify, in the draft report as well as the final report, it consists of three major sections: the letter to the administrator, the consensus responses to the charge questions, and then all of your individual comments. So your individual comments will still make it into the draft report. And EPA is generally pretty faithful to go through those and make what changes they can. But if it's something you feel very strongly about that needs to be included into the consensus responses, that's what needs to be brought up during the deliberations in the public meeting.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's helpful. And particularly, we want to recognize that we have a number of new people, and so this is an important time to make sure things are clear to everyone. Alexandra.
Just one additional question. When are the final comments going to be due? When should we submit those?
So, and this is something we can discuss at the end of the December meeting as well. But generally, I think we were targeting after the December holidays. So probably around the first of the year, that first week of January, everything would be due. So, so we generally will give you opportunity to revise your preliminary individual comments. So basically finalize your individual comments. If you don't have any revisions to the preliminary comments, let me know that as well. And then your subgroups will also need to finalize your consensus responses. So both to the ISA supplement as well as the PA. So you have to pace yourself a little bit here. So don't wait till the week before the last week of December to do all this, because you'll need to float those responses to one another within the subgroup and agree, so that you can, your subgroup can come to consensus and send those to me and Leanne by the first week of January.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and in terms of pacing yourself, you may find that you want to try to finalize your preliminary comments now, and then if something comes up when you're writing your consensus comments, Aaron can take multiple versions, and he's pretty good at, recognizing which one's the final one. So, that's one way to sort of pace yourself, is to try to finalize your individual comments now and just allow yourself permission to update them later if something emerges. All right, is there anything else that we need to cover? Is there anything, I know EPA already had a chance to make clarifying comments, but I invite EPA at this time, if there's anything else that you want to say, that since we have a couple minutes left, I'll invite you to say it. Just raise your hand so that I know. No, not required, completely optional. Steve.
Since we've got the time, I would just, again, thank the panel for all the incredibly helpful comments. You saw a few of our staff members on the call here, but we've got a huge team that's also been listening in on the live stream. So we just appreciate everything, all the input that you provided, all the input that the public has provided during the comment sessions, and we'll incorporate all this into our revisions. And we look forward to hearing the additional deliberations in December and reconvening and hearing additional deliberations next year as well. So we just appreciate all your time and effort that you're putting into this.
Thank you, Steve. And I think with that, we've talked about, we've gone over a summary of our meeting, and we've talked about action items in terms of next steps with respect to the conversation we had today. And of course, you already know in terms of preparation for a couple of weeks from now, and many people have already submitted your preliminary comments. So I think we're ready to adjourn.
Yes, so actually we'll be recessing until December 1st.
Thank you. Wrong word, recess, not adjourn, right?
So we'll be in recess until December 1st. So we'll see you all again December 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a very productive meeting.